Welcome to Soft Sleep Tales, a channel where timeless stories, gentle narration, and quiet atmospheres help you drift into rest. Before we begin tonight's tale, I'd love to know, where are you listening from? Share it in the comments below. It's always wonderful to see our little community stretching across the world. Now, it's time to get comfortable. Settle into your bed or favorite chair. Close your eyes. Take a slow, deep breath. Let the day melt away. Allow my voice to carry you softly into sleep to a place where imagination flows and dreams begin. There is a lane in Oxfordshire that does not appear on any map of consequence, and yet those who have walked its length will tell you, quietly, and with a particular settling of the eyes, as though they are looking at it even now from wherever they happen to be sitting, that it is one of the most real places they have ever known. It runs between the village of Nettleford and the edge of Ashmore Wood, no more than 3/4 of a mile from one end to the other, and it is bordered on both sides by ancient Wych Elm trees, whose roots have grown so long and so deep into the Oxfordshire limestone that geologists from the University at Oxford once speculated, over a dinner that was perhaps more animated than such dinners usually are, that those roots might reach the old Roman road, buried some 12 feet below the surface of the lane, a road that was itself built over something older, and that something over something older still, all the way down to the bare chalk bedrock, where time runs differently, and the categories of before and after lose much of their urgency. The lane itself is made of compacted chalk and clay, packed down by centuries of use, worn so smooth in its centre that on a dry morning you can see the sky reflected in its palest sections, as though in very still water. On wet mornings, which are the majority of mornings in this part of England, through the autumn and winter and most of the spring, the lane holds the rain in its slight depression and becomes, for a few hours, a shallow mirror of clouds and bare branches, and whatever bird happens to be passing overhead on its way to Ashmore Wood. The lane's surface changes personality with the weather in the way that only very old surfaces do. Things that have been receiving weather for long enough that they have developed a kind of relationship with it, a mutual accommodation, neither surface nor weather, entirely what it is without the other. In the late weeks of October and the first half of November, which is where this story properly begins, though it will take you through winter and into the first warmth of returning spring, the lane becomes one of the most quietly beautiful corridors in all of southern England. The wych elms, which are broader canopied than the English elm and which hold their leaves somewhat longer into autumn, turn first to a warm amber in the second week of October, then to a deeper and more saturated gold in the third week, and then, in the days just before the leaves begin to fall in earnest, to a colour that exists at the very edge of what the English language is equipped to name. It is not amber, it is not gold, it is the colour that amber and gold produce when they are mixed with October afternoon light and filtered through several centuries of patience, and it has, on certain mornings, the quality of something that is generating its own illumination rather than merely reflecting what falls upon it. The leaves, when they begin to fall, do not come down in sudden curtains driven by sharp winds. They come down the way things come down in places that have no interest in drama, individually or in pairs, in long, slow, spiraling descents that carry them sometimes several feet sideways before they reach the lane surface, where they settle among their predecessors with the quiet finality of one more sentence, added to a manuscript that has been in progress for a very long time. The sound they make is almost nothing, almost. If you are standing in the lane in the right conditions, a still morning, the first light just coming through the canopy, the world not yet fully awake to itself, you can hear each leaf land, a sound below the threshold of most human attention, a sound that requires a particular quality of listening to hear at all, the kind of listening that most people do not practice and that very few people have made the center of their lives. This place is real. You may find it if you are patient, and if you take the correct turning east of the village of Islip, off the B4027, where the road bends near the old stone wall with the iron gate. The lane exists. The Wych Elms still stand, those that survived the great dying of the 20th century, their survivors now massive and grey-barked and solemn, grown to a size that the trees of 1883 were still approaching, still working toward with the unhurried ambition of things that measure their progress in decades rather than years. The characters in this story, however, are not real. Arthur Bellamy never lived in the stone cottage at the lane's southern end. He never walked the lane in his charcoal tweed overcoat on cold October mornings. Never stood at the stone stile listening to the things that the lane had to say. Never wrote in his notebook by firelight the observations that constituted his daily record of the world. The woman who came to live in the old keeper's house in November of 1883 did not exist. Her brother, who came at Christmas and again in March, was never there. The conversations they had between them, by fires, over tea tables, on the bench at the northern end of the lane in the late afternoon light, were never spoken, but everything around them was real and is real and will remain real long after this story has been told and forgotten and told again. The light was real. The cold was real. The sound of the elm canopy in a November wind and the sound of a single thrush on a clear December morning in Ashmore Wood and the sound of the lane in deep winter when the frost has hardened everything to silence and the only sound is your own breathing and the barely audible groan of elm wood in the cold. All of that is as true as limestone, as true as chalk, as true as the particular quality of English winter light that has no equivalent in any other country and no proper name in any language. The reality is the lane, and the light, and the cold, and the turning of the year. The story is what happens when a person gives all of their attention to these things for long enough, with sufficient patience and care. You need do nothing now, but let yourself become still. Let your breathing find its own rhythm, slower than thinking, slower than the day has been. Let the weight of the evening settle around you like the weight of a good coat on a cold afternoon, not heavy exactly, but present and warm and sufficient. The lane is waiting, the fire is already lit, the kettle is almost ready. Come. The first thing Arthur Bellamy did each morning, before he lit the stove, before he put the kettle on, before he even opened his eyes, was listen. He lay in the grey half-light of an October Tuesday with a heavy wool blanket pulled to his chin and the cold of the room held just at the edges of the warmth his body had made through the night. And he listened to what the world was doing without him, This was not a habit he had constructed deliberately. He could not point to a morning when he had decided to begin it, could not remember a version of himself that did not do this. It seemed, when he thought about it at all, to be something he had always done, had done as a child in the Shropshire village where he was born, lying in the early mornings in the bed he had shared with his younger brother, listening to the sounds of the house and the street and the fields beyond the street, sorting them with the unconscious expertise of a child who has not yet learned that the world does not require this kind of attention and who has not yet been told to stop. His father, who was a schoolmaster of the old and thoughtful variety, had believed that silence was a form of intelligence and that those who could not tolerate it were, in some fundamental way, afraid of what they might hear if they allowed it. This belief delivered not as instruction but as lived example. His father sitting quietly in rooms while other people filled rooms with speech. His father pausing before answering questions in a way that made the answer, when it came, feel considered and therefore worth considering, had shaped Arthur more than any lesson formally given. He was not afraid of silence. He had built his life around it with the care and deliberateness of a man constructing something he intends to outlast him. He lay on this October morning in the particular warmth of a bed that has been occupied all night and is therefore perfectly calibrated to its occupant. And he listened to the lane. The lane came to him through the thick stone walls of the cottage with a clarity that had surprised him in his first weeks here, 11 years ago, and which he had long since ceased to find surprising and had instead come to regard as one of the most reliable pleasures of his daily life. The sound was not loud. It was never loud. But it was present always, with a consistency that he found deeply settling, the sound of a world that was doing what it had always done, regardless of what any particular morning required of him. On this morning, the wind was moving through the elm canopy with a long, slow, lateral motion. Not a gusting wind, but a sustained wind with a kind of intention to it, as though it had somewhere it needed to be, but was taking the scenic route. The sound it made in the remaining leaves, those that had not yet fallen, perhaps a third of the full complement still attached, was a complex layered sound, each leaf making its own contribution and the whole producing something that existed between music and weather. There was a dry quality to the sound, a papery quality that told him, without his needing to look, that the leaves were at the stage where they are ready, but not quite yet willing, the final days of their attachment, when the colour is deepest and the letting go is imminent. Beneath the leaf sound, much lower, barely at the threshold of perception, was the slow creak of the elm trunks themselves. Very old trees in a moderate wind produce this sound, a long, low wooden groan that seems to come from deep inside the wood rather than from the surface, a sound that speaks of great mass and great age, accommodating, without distress, something that would be distressing to smaller and younger things. Arthur had spent some time in his early years on the lane trying to describe the sound in his notebook, and had eventually settled on a single word that he used as a kind of shorthand when he wrote about it. Patience. The sound of the elm trunks in the wind was the sound of patience. Not the patience of waiting for something to end, but the patience of being so fully what you are The time passes differently. There was something else this morning. Something at the edge of the elm and wind sound, further away, arriving intermittently on the wind's longer waves. A cart. The wheels on the Nettleford Road, which ran north of the lane and which he could hear on still mornings, almost as clearly as he could hear the lane itself. The horse was working steadily. He could detect, or imagined he could detect, the rhythm of the hooves, regular and unhurried, the sound of a working animal that knows its business, a milk cart, perhaps, on the early rounds. He lay and let these sounds layer themselves in his awareness, not sorting or cataloguing them, simply receiving them, the way a pool receives rain, the surface changed by each drop, the whole constituted by the accumulation. After some time, 5 minutes perhaps, or 15, on mornings such as this the distinction was not particularly useful. He became aware of the quality of light changing behind his closed eyelids. The grey pre-dawn light was brightening almost imperceptibly, moving through its gradations with a patience that matched the lane's own, and he felt his eyes prepare to open. He let them. He looked at the ceiling of the shore bedroom, which was whitewashed plaster with a slight roughness to it that had held, over the years, the marks of 11 winters' worth of condensation and 11 summers' worth of heat, and which had become, for Arthur, as familiar a surface as the page of a well-read book. Arthur Bellamy was 61 years old on this October morning. He was a tall man, had been a very tall man in his youth, straight and angular, who had, in the last decade, begun the slight forward lean of someone who has spent many years attending to things at a lower level than his own eyeline. His shoulders had a gentle roundness to them that was not weakness or age so much as the physical expression of a long habit of inclination, of bending toward things worth closer examination. His hair was almost entirely white, and it was thick, and it had the quality of hair that has always done what it wished and has never been significantly persuaded otherwise. His face was deeply but not unkindly lined, the lines concentrated around the eyes, which were grey and which had, in recent years, taken on the characteristic expression of eyes that have looked carefully at a great many things and have arrived at a settled view of what most things are, though they remain open to revision. He had been a schoolmaster for 23 years, teaching Latin and natural history at a grammar school in Abingdon, to boys who were, in his experience, more interesting and more capable than the institution that contained them. He had never married. This was not, in his own assessment, a deficit. It was simply the shape his life had taken, and he had come to regard the shape of his life the way he regarded the lane, as something with its own character and its own integrity that deserved to be understood on its own terms, rather than measured against some other template. He had come to the cottage in December of 1872 with 2 trunks of books, a set of watercolor paints he had not used in 15 years, and which he nonetheless retained with the faithful optimism of a man who believes he will eventually return to unfinished business and an agreement with the landowner, a gentleman farmer named Hesketh, broad and red-faced and fundamentally decent, who lived in the larger house at the lane's northern end, and who found the business of the lane a pleasant but ultimately secondary concern. To occupy the old stone cottage at the lane's southern terminus in exchange for a reasonable rent and a general watchfulness. Keeper, Hesketh had called him. It had seemed at the time a practical arrangement. Arthur had come to understand it, over 11 years, as a vocation. He turned back the blanket. The cold of the room arrived at once, precise and complete, and he breathed it in and felt it define the edges of him, the way cold always does, making the boundary between self and world clearly legible. He sat up. He put his feet on the cold wooden floor. He began. The stove occupied the corner of the kitchen with the settled authority of something that has been in the same place for so long that the room has arranged itself around it, has grown used to the stove's dimensions, its warmth, its particular requirements. It was a large iron range of a model that had been considered modern perhaps 15 years ago, and which had now arrived at the more honourable condition of simply being very good. It had a small firebox on the left and a larger one on the right that fed the oven above, and it had a footrail along the bottom that had been rubbed smooth by 11 years of Arthur's boot heels, resting against it on cold mornings while he waited for water to boil. The morning ritual of the stove was not a simple thing, though Arthur had made it look simple through long practice. The damper first opened fully, so that the cold air in the chimney was drawn down and out before the fire was lit. Otherwise the smoke would come back into the kitchen, which it had done on several occasions in his early months here before he had properly understood the stove's particular character. Then the ashes of the previous day's fire raked forward and removed from the grate. On cold mornings, this produced a small amount of residual warmth from whatever heat remained in the buried coals, a warmth that arrived at his hands as a faint ghost of yesterday's fire. Then the kindling, arranged with the care of a man who has learned that kindling arranged carelessly produces a fire that is also careless. 2 or 3 sticks of split hazel from the basket beside the stove, laid across 2 slightly larger sticks of ash with a twist of old newspaper beneath. Then the match, held at the exact angle that years of experience had established as the reliable one, introduced at the exact point in the arrangement, where the newspaper was closest to the kindling, and the draught, now that the damper was properly open, was sufficient to encourage rather than smother. The fire caught with the small bright sound it always made, a brief crackling rush, a settling into steadiness, and then the low, reliable voice of a fire that has decided to continue. Arthur straightened, his knees registering the cold of the stone floor through his boots, and went to the pump in the yard. The yard was the coldest place the morning offered. It was small, enclosed on 3 sides by the stone cottage and a low stone wall, with the hen house along the wall's far end and the woodpile against the wall's south face. And in October, at this hour, it had a quality of concentrated cold that was different from the cold of open spaces, denser, stiller, contained by the walls in the same way that the warmth of the kitchen would later be contained. The flagstones were dark with moisture, not quite frost. The temperature had not quite reached the threshold, and his boots made a particular sound on them, a flat, heavy sound absorbed quickly by the stone walls that he associated with early morning in the way you associate certain sounds with certain times of day and cannot easily separate them. The water from the pump came up very cold, cold enough to make his hands ache slightly with the pleasure of the cold, and he filled the kettle and carried it back into the kitchen, where the fire had already begun to assert its warmth on the immediate air around the stove. He set the kettle down, the particular sound of iron on iron, the small hiss as a drop of water from the spout met the hot surface of the stove, and straightened again and turned to the kitchen window. The kitchen window was a deep-set thing, the stone of the sill nearly a foot thick, and it looked directly north onto the lane. At this hour, the lane was still mostly in darkness. The eastern sky was beginning to lighten, but had not yet delivered enough light to reach down between the elm canopy and illuminate the lane surface. What he could see was largely shape and depth, the pale suggestion of the chalk path, the dark mass of the elm trunks on either side, the slightly lighter darkness of the sky between the upper branches. He could hear the lane, though. The wind was still there, still working through the remaining leaves with that long, dry sound, though it had changed character slightly since he had listened from bed. It was, if anything, more deliberate now, steadier, as though it had resolved something in the night and was now simply getting on with it. He stood at the window with his hands braced on the cold stone sill and listened, and the kettle behind him began the slow process of deciding to boil. He had learned in his first year on the lane that the stove and the kettle had their own conversation in the mornings, a conversation that progressed through several recognizable stages, from the first ticking of the metal warming to the long pre-boil murmur to the full rolling boil that always seemed in the particular acoustics of the low-ceilinged kitchen, rather more emphatic than strictly necessary. He had learned to use the duration of this conversation as a frame for the morning's first window standing, a period of looking and listening that was neither prayer nor meditation, but which had the quality of both, without requiring the vocabulary of either. The lane this morning was doing what it did best in the third week of October. It was luminous in a way that was difficult to account for given the absence of direct light, a kind of self-contained luminosity in the gold that still remained on the uppermost branches, the last color, the deepest color, holding out against the morning dark with the same quiet persistence as everything else about this particular lane. He made the tea with 3 spoonfuls from the tin caddy, the caddy his sister Margaret had given him some years before it was conventional to have given it, the caddy being one of the objects in the cottage that had a personal history attached to it, a warmth that came not from any quality of the object itself, but from the circumstances of its giving. He allowed the leaves 4 minutes in the pot, which was the length of time that produced, in his experience, exactly the right strength, strong enough to be honest about itself, not so strong as to become aggressive. He took the cup to the window chair, the old wing-back chair of faded green velvet that had been in the kitchen when he arrived, and which, in the way of objects that suit a person perfectly, had come to seem over the years less like a piece of furniture in a room and more like a place, a specific destination in the geography of the morning. And he sat and he drew his feet up onto the rail of the chair, and he held the cup in both hands and let the warmth of it inform his palms. And he looked at the lane. The eastern light, while he had been making tea, had progressed through its stages with the unhurried competence of a natural process that requires no assistance. The darkness in the lane was now a deep blue-grey rather than a true black, and the chalk path was visible as a pale ribbon between the dark elm trunks, and the gold of the highest remaining leaves had begun to catch the first real colour of the day, which was the thinnest possible gilding, not yet gold, but the suggestion of gold, a warmth in the light that was more temperamental than actual. He drank his tea. The fire in the stove settled into its working voice. The lane outside the window revealed itself degree by slow degree to the arriving morning. This was the other part of the ritual, the listening from bed, and then the looking from the window chair. Together, they constituted what Arthur thought of, not in these words, which were too formal for so habitual a thing, but in something like the feeling of these words as his daily taking of account, a record of what the world was doing, a confirmation that it was still doing it. He sat for a long time in the green chair, and the October morning came to itself around him, and the lane outside was entirely beautiful, and the tea was exactly right. Arthur's mornings, in the way of mornings belonging to those who have arranged their lives to be largely their own, established their character early and maintained it with a pleasing fidelity that he had come, over the years, to regard not as routine, but as something more like integrity, the integrity of a day that knows what it is for and does not attempt to be something else. A Tuesday in late October meant, after the tea and the window sitting, a walk the full length of the lane before the light changed. He changed nothing about his dress for this, except to add the overcoat, the long charcoal tweed overcoat that he had purchased in his last years in Abingdon at a tailor's shop on the High Street, and which had been, in the decade since, subjected to every kind of English weather, and had emerged from each encounter looking slightly better than it had before, as good tweed does, the weather seeming to deepen and improve the fabric's character rather than diminish it. He added also a dark wool scarf, wrapped twice around his neck and tucked into the overcoat's lapels, and his grey wool gloves, and he took his walking stick from the hall, an ash stick, plain, no handle of any kind, simply a length of ash that had been cut and smoothed and carried until it knew the shape of his hand as well as his hand knew the shape of it. He went through the front door and through the gate and onto the lane. The cold was immediate and entire. Not an aggressive cold, not the cold that shoves. The cold of a late October morning in an Oxfordshire valley at this hour was a cold that occupied the air with a full and quiet authority, the way a person of complete confidence occupies a room. It arrived at every exposed surface of him simultaneously, the skin of his face, the backs of his hands above the gloves, the strip of neck between, the scarf, and the coat's collar. It entered his lungs with each breath as a clean sharpness, slightly resinous from the elm wood, slightly mineral from the chalk beneath the lane surface, and he breathed it in with the straightforward pleasure of a man who has never been able to understand people who do not enjoy cold mornings. His boots on the chalk lane surface were the loudest sound in the world. The lane was in one of its deeply still moments. The wind that had been present in the canopy earlier had settled or moved on, and the leaves that remained on the trees were not moving, and the leaves that had fallen were not moving, and the lane received his footsteps with a sound that was clear and clean and slightly resonant, the chalk giving the sound a particular quality you would not get on a soft surface, a slight ring to it, a note. He walked northward toward the village. The lane was, at this particular hour, between what it had been and what it was becoming. The gold of the canopy was still present, but thinning, not diminished in quality, if anything richer and deeper than it had been in the earlier weeks of October, but reduced in quantity. More sky was visible through the canopy than a week ago. The sky that came through was pale, the colour of chalk washed by rain, and it provided a background against which the remaining gold of the leaves appeared almost incandescent, not glowing exactly, but holding a warmth that seemed disproportionate to the cold of the air around them. He moved at the pace the lane seemed to require, which was slower than his natural walking pace, and slower even than the pace he had walked at when he first came here. The lane had, over 11 years, done something to his gait. Had slowed it, or perhaps more accurately, had revealed to him what his natural pace actually was, beneath the pace required by the school timetable and the obligations of a life organized around the needs of other people. This was his pace. This slow, regular, boot-on-chalk pace, unhurried enough that he could hear everything. He stopped at the old stone stile midway along the lane, the one set into the limestone wall on the eastern side, giving access to the field path that led toward Ashmore Wood, and put one hand on the top stone, which was worn smooth by generations of palms, and sat under his gloved hand with the solid satisfaction of a thing shaped by long use. He stood here and simply listened. A robin was singing in the elm directly above the stile. The autumn robin's song is a different thing from the summer one, and Arthur had thought about this difference for some years without being entirely satisfied with any formulation he had arrived at. The summer song was assertive, territorial, confident, a song of established fact. The autumn song was something else, more provisional perhaps, more exploratory, as though the bird were asking something rather than stating something, and were not entirely certain of the answer. He found it, if anything, more affecting than the summer song, precisely for this reason. Its uncertainty gave it a quality of genuine inquiry that the summer song, for all its beauty, did not have. Beneath the robin, at a greater distance, a wood pigeon called from somewhere deep in the canopy, a sound so completely itself, so round and slow and self-contained, that it seemed less like a sound a bird was making and more like a quality the morning already possessed that was simply becoming audible. And beneath both of those, beneath the birds and beneath the wind and leaf sounds, and beneath the sound of the distant farm, there was a layer of sound that was not so much heard as felt, a low, sustained quality of the lane that he had no precise word for, and which he had described in his notebook at various times as a resonance, a ground note, the voice of the limestone itself. He was not certain what produced it. Perhaps the wind at a frequency below the threshold of what the ear registers as sound, but above the threshold of what the body registers as nothing. Perhaps simply the acoustic character of a limestone valley, carrying the sum of its own natural processes. Whatever it was always there, always the same, and the effect of standing in the lane and attending to it, allowing it to become perceptible beneath the more obvious sounds, was the effect of reaching down through several layers of the world and touching something very old and very steady at its base. He stood at the stile for quite a long time, longer than he had intended, which was often the way of things on the lane. Time had a different quality here, not slower exactly, not stretched or distorted, but more fully itself, as though each minute contained its full complement of experience rather than the reduced complement that busy minutes generally manage. He was aware of this and was grateful for it, without feeling any particular urgency about understanding it further. Some things were better understood as experience than as analysis, and the quality of time on Wych Elm Lane was one of them. The robin sang 3 notes, a pause, 2 more notes, lower, then silence. Arthur stood in the silence for a moment, giving it the respect it deserved. Then he straightened, removed his hand from the stile stone, and walked on toward the northern end. At the northern end of the lane, where it met the Nettleford road, there stood a bench that Arthur himself had positioned there 5 years ago, having spent the better part of a March afternoon in the project. The bench itself, carried up from the cottage yard in sections, the legs and the seat and the back, and assembled against the last elm on the western side with the painstaking care of a man who was aligning it, not merely with the elm, but with a particular angle of view that he had been thinking about for some time. The bench faced south, directly down the full length of the lane. This was the point. From this position on the bench, in the right light, with the right weather, the lane presented itself in its entirety, all 3/4 of a mile of it, the elm trunks rising on either side, the chalk path narrowing between them in the proper perspective of a very long enclosed corridor, the canopy arching above all of this, and at the very far end, just visible, exactly visible, at the threshold of what the human eye can resolve with comfort at this distance, the dark grey shape of his cottage, its chimney, and in the mornings that had smoke rising from the chimney, the thin pale thread of that smoke ascending in the still air with a straightness that always struck him as one of the more quietly perfect visual facts in his daily experience. He sat on the bench now, as he often did at this point of the morning walk, and looked south. The lane in late October, seen from this northern vantage, had a quality that it did not have from any other position. From here you saw the full extent of the colour, the remaining gold of the canopy, strung between the elm trunks, the length of the lane like something very old and very deliberate, the accumulated gold of weeks of slow autumn ripening, all of it visible simultaneously. From here you could see the way the light moved through the corridor from east to west. The eastern side of the lane where the elms grew in the field wall was more lit at this hour, its bark carrying the early morning light along its surface in a pale warm wash, while the western side was in shadow, its bark appearing in the deep green-grey of bark that has been in shadow for months. He had developed, over 11 years of sitting on this bench at various hours and in various weather conditions, a fairly complete understanding of what the lane looked like from this point at every time of day through every season. And this knowledge, this accumulated visual knowledge, was one of the things he considered most properly his own. Not knowledge in the way that the Latin declensions were knowledge, or the Latin poets, or the taxonomic structures of the natural world, all of which he also held and valued. But knowledge in a more intimate sense, felt knowledge, the knowledge that lives in the body and in the habits of attention, rather than in the mind, and which cannot be conveyed in words because it did not arrive in words and does not reside in words. He knew, sitting on this bench, that the third elm from the northern end, on the eastern side, had been developing a slight lean toward the south-southwest for approximately 7 years. He knew this, not because he had measured it, he had not, but because he had looked at it often enough and carefully enough that the change, which was invisible to any ordinary inspection, had registered in the accumulated visual record that his long attendance had produced. He knew that the spot on the lane surface, where it dipped into a slight hollow, the bowl that filled with water after heavy rain, was exactly 23 meters from the bench. He knew this because he had counted his paces to it once on a morning when he had been in a counting mood, and the number had stuck. He knew the lane the way you know a person after many years of honest attention, not through any single act of knowing, not through any decisive moment of understanding, but through the slow accumulation of unremarkable observations, each one adding its small increment to a knowledge that had no definitive form and no final state, but which was, in its incompleteness, more real and more useful than any more systematic inventory could have been. He sat on the bench for perhaps 25 minutes. The light moved down the canopy, changing as it moved, the quality of the gold in the leaves shifting as the sun's angle changed, becoming at some moments flatter and at other moments more saturated, as though the leaves were breathing the color in and out. A pair of jackdaws moved through the canopy from west to east, calling once each and then falling silent. Somewhere in the upper reaches of the lane, a leaf detached, he could not see which one, and descended in a long, unhurried spiral, disappearing behind the screen of lower branches before it reached the lane surface. He breathed the cold air. He was warm enough in the overcoat, warm enough in the scarf and gloves. The bench beneath him was very cold through his trousers, but he had long since accepted this as part of the experience and had decided that the slight cold discomfort was a useful thing, keeping him present in the body and therefore present in the lane rather than drifting too far into the kind of pure abstraction that a more comfortable perch might permit. He rose eventually, turned his collar higher against a breath of wind that had arrived from the north, and walked south toward the cottage and breakfast, down the full length of the lane that he had spent 11 years learning to see. Arthur cooked breakfast with the same unhurried competence that characterized everything he did with his hands, which was not the competence of a man who had always known how to do these things, but the competence of a man who had been obliged to learn them and had found in the learning a genuine satisfaction. He had not cooked for himself before coming to the cottage. In Abingdon, he had taken his meals at the house of a widow who provided board to 3 of the schoolmasters, and before that, in the various lodgings of his earlier life, the arrangements had been similar, meals provided by landladies who had found each of them that Arthur was a quiet and appreciative guest who required very little and caused no trouble, and who was, without ever making a particular effort to be so, Rather good company at the table if you happen to be interested in the kind of conversation he was inclined toward, which was to say, the world observed closely. He scrambled 2 eggs from his 3 hens, Mrs. Brown, Mrs. White, and a smaller hen of no particular colour, for which he had never found quite the right name, and who had eventually become simply the hen, which he seemed to have accepted without complaint, and toasted 2 slices from the Saturday loaf, which was still good, though beginning to approach the stage of its life that he privately preferred, where the crumb had firmed slightly, and the crust had deepened in flavour, and the bread had become, through the passage of a few days, more fully itself. He ate at the kitchen table, which was a plain deal table of no particular distinction that had been here when he arrived, and which had absorbed, over 11 years, the various marks of his daily use. A ring from a hot cup, a faint scratch along one edge from an occasion he could not now remember, a general warmth to the wood from long acquaintance with the kitchen's heat. He read while he ate. He was currently reading, in the mornings, a natural history of the chalk downlands of southern England, a slightly dry text written by a man who had clearly known his subject better than he knew his sentences, but full of the kind of specific observation that Arthur found nourishing in a way that more elegantly written generalities were not. After breakfast, he washed the plate and cup and the scrambling pan, dried them, put them on the wooden rack, wiped the table. These acts of kitchen maintenance he performed with the same complete attention he brought to everything else, not as chores to be gotten through, but as the continuation of the morning's engagement with the physical world, the warmth of the water, the weight of the plate, the sound of the cup going on to the wooden rack. Then he moved through to the sitting room. The sitting room was the room that showed who he was, to any observer equipped to read it. The bookshelves, which covered 3 walls in stages, the first set built in his 2nd year, the second in his 5th, the third, a creative improvisation along the fireplace wall involving timber from the barn and a pair of iron brackets he had found beneath the woodpile, were organized according to a system that was perfectly legible to him and would have been opaque to anyone else, being arranged by period and then by temperamental affinity rather than by author or subject, so that the Roman poets shared a shelf with Gilbert White and Darwin because all 3 operated, in his view, from the same fundamental disposition, a willingness to look at the actual world with sustained and loving attention. The notebook was on the table beside his reading chair. He opened it to the most recent entry from the evening before, written by firelight in the slightly smaller and more compressed hand that firelight writing always produced from him, as though the closeness of the warmth encouraged a kind of economy. The entry read, October. The canopy is in its last days of full colour. I estimate perhaps a week before the majority is gone, though the upper branches of the 3rd elm on the western side are holding particularly well. That tree has always been a little behind the others, as though it is taking a last look around before letting go. The light this afternoon at 4 o'clock in the gap where the old storm tree was, worth noting, white gold quality, no name for it yet. Tomorrow, perhaps. He closed the notebook and looked at the fire. It was burning low at this hour, the morning coals settling into a deep orange that heated the room evenly. and made the particular sound of a well-managed fire, a deep, quiet crackling, almost below the threshold of a hearing, punctuated occasionally by the soft collapse of a coal. The room was warm in the specific way of rooms heated by coal fires. From the floor upward, the warmth arriving first at foot level and building gradually toward the ceiling, so that the air at sitting height was perfectly comfortable, and the air at standing height was noticeably warmer. He sat in the red leather chair and let the warmth of the room settle around him, and thought about what he had written about the third elm on the western side, about the phrase taking a last look around, and found that the anthropomorphism did not embarrass him. It was not accurate as science, it was accurate as feeling, and feeling, honestly attended to, was a different category of accuracy, valuable in its own way, and not to be dismissed simply because it could not be measured. He walked to Nettleford in the early afternoon, when the light was at its most useful for the walk, not the golden morning light, which was too beautiful for the practical business of going to the village, and not the fading afternoon light, which arrived in October with a speed that could catch you on the return journey. The mid-afternoon light of late October was a pale and honest light, a working light that showed everything clearly and warmly without particular drama, and in it the lane looked somewhat different from its morning self. Less gold, more brown, the colours deeper and more settled, the shadows longer and more defined, the whole scene more like an interior than an exterior, like a room rather than a sky. He wore the charcoal overcoat and the dark scarf for the afternoon walk, and added his soft felt hat, dark grey, with a brim worn slightly soft at one edge from the habit of lifting it with the left hand, which he wore on afternoon walks and on Sundays. The hat had been his father's, and before that, his father's father's, or so the family story went, though the hat had been re-blocked and re-ribboned at some point, and bore little resemblance to whatever it had originally been. He wore it now as a matter of habit more than sentiment, though sentiment was not entirely absent. The lane in the afternoon had leafful that the morning had not. The temperature in mid-afternoon was slightly higher than the morning's, the air slightly less, still, and this small increase in both temperature and movement had coaxed some hundreds of leaves from their positions and sent them to the lane floor, so that the drifts that had been ankle-deep in the morning were, in places, approaching knee-depth. Not in the lane's centre, where the chalk was still visible as a pale seam, but at the margins, where the drifts built up against the base of the walls and the roots of the elms. He walked through them on his way north, enjoying the sound, the dry brush of many leaves against the toe of his boot, a sound at once vigorous and quiet, the sound of accumulated small things making themselves known, and thought about what Margaret had written in her last letter, which he had been carrying in his coat pocket since its arrival 2 days before, and had not yet answered. Margaret, who was 4 years younger and lived in Ludlow in Shropshire, and taught at a small school for girls, and who was, of all the people Arthur had known in his life, the one whose mind worked most like his own. She had written about a morning she had had in the middle of October, standing at her window above the stationer's shop in the grey early light, watching the town below her begin its day, and had found that she could not move from the window for nearly an hour, held there by something she could not name, a quality of the morning that seemed to require her presence in a way that she could not justify but could not ignore. Is this what you do every day? She had written. Is this the practice? Because if so, I begin to understand why you have not come home. He had read this and smiled. He had not come home, had not gone back to Shropshire, to the county of his birth, for some years now. Not because he did not love Shropshire, but because he had, at some point in the middle years of his time on the lane, arrived at a relationship with this particular place that made other places feel not unpleasant but not necessary. He was, without having chosen the word for himself, rooted. The lane had done something to him that he would not have predicted, and that he still could not fully explain to his sister, though he had been attempting to in his weekly letters for 11 years. He entered Nettleford from the south end of the lane, where the lane met the road, and walked through the village with the particular gait of a man who knows a small place well, not hurried, not dawdling, but moving through it with the easy attention of someone who lives in it, noting what had changed since his last visit 3 days before, and what, as was more usual, had not. Ayres was in the post office, which was to say, Ayres was exactly where he always was, behind the dark wooden counter with its glass-fronted drawers of postal items and its scales and its long-handled wooden stamp. Wearing his dark brown apron and regarding the world with the equanimity of a man who has seen enough of it from this fixed point to have arrived at a settled view. "How's the lane?" Ayres asked, which was not the same question every time, though it used the same words. "Coming down faster this afternoon," Arthur said. "The drifts are knee-high in places by the walls." Ayres received this information and with a nod suggested he was filing it alongside all the other information he had received about the lane over the years, building in his own way a parallel record. He pushed 2 letters across the counter, both from Margaret, both in her large confident hand, the second one postmarked a day after the first, which meant she had written again when she thought of something more, which was her habit and which Arthur considered one of her finest qualities. "Cold enough for you?" Ayres asked. "Almost," Arthur said, which was honest. "Another degree and we'll be there." "Tonight, perhaps," Ayres said, with the calm authority of a man who has spent many years reading the weather from a window that faces north. They stood in the comfortable silence of 2 people who have no need to fill silence. And then Arthur thanked him and took his letters and went back out into the pale October afternoon and walked back down through the village and turned south onto the lane. The walk back to the cottage in the later afternoon had a quality entirely different from the morning walk and the outward walk. The light was coming from the southwest now, lower and warmer, and where the lane ran northeast to southwest, it caught this light along its full length, and the remaining leaves in the canopy were lit from below, a quality of light that produced in the elm leaves a transparency that was different from the reflected gold of the morning. In this light, you could see the structure of each leaf, its veins and its edges, backlit by the southwest sun, and their overall effect was of being inside something rather than outside it, inside a room whose walls and ceiling were made of translucent amber gold material and whose floor was a pale chalk path that led at the end to a small grey cottage with a thin, straight thread of smoke rising from its chimney. He walked slowly. He always walked slowly on the way home. Walking back through the lane in the late afternoon, Arthur became aware of something that had not been there in the morning. He was not certain when he became aware of it, which was in itself interesting. It did not arrive with any particular announcement, did not register as a sudden perception, but simply accumulated at the edge of his attention over the course of perhaps 30 steps, until it had become sufficiently present to require acknowledgement. He slowed, which he did not always consciously decide to do. His feet had their own response to the lane, and often acted before his thinking mind had caught up with them. He stopped. The gap in the canopy on the eastern side of the lane, approximately 40 meters south of the stone stile. The gap that had been created, though at a hotter, previous winter when a large elm had come down in a February storm, the wood taken away by Hesketh's man in the spring, leaving a clear space between the two surviving elms on either side. This gap was doing something he had not seen it do before. The gap was roughly 15 feet wide at canopy height, and perhaps somewhat wider at ground level, where the root system of the fallen tree had pulled up the soil in a rough mound that had since settled and begun to be colonized by the usual opportunistic plants. Nettles in spring and summer, now brown and soft with frost damage. Through this gap, at this exact hour of the afternoon, the southwest light was entering the lane at an angle that was possible only in the final weeks of October, when the sun was at its specific late autumn declination. The light came through the gap in a broad, slightly dispersed column, not a beam exactly, not a defined shaft, but a broad flowing of light that fell on a section of the lane approximately 4 meters in diameter, and which fell on this section at a moment when the leash drift on that section of the lane floor was at its deepest, and the leaves that composed the drift were of a particular age, past the fresh fallen gold, past the dry brown of deep autumn, arrived at the intermediate stage where the top layer was still amber and the lower layers were working toward a deep, almost burnt orange, and the effect of this specific quality of light on this specific quantity and quality of leaf was not gold. It was white, or not quite white, not the white of a blank page or of clean snow, but the color that gold produces when it is seen from directly below in soft, dispersed backlight, which is a near white with a warmth at its edges that was unlike anything Arthur had a name for. Old ivory was the nearest he could come, but not ivory, not quite. Something beyond ivory, in the direction of light. He stood in the lane and looked at it for a considerable time. He was aware, as he stood, of several things at once in the way that moments of genuine visual intensity produce a broadening of awareness rather than a narrowing. He was aware of the temperature, cold, complete, unchanged. He was aware of the sound, a very faint movement of air through the gap, a sighing quality quite different from the general elm wind sound, as though the gap had its own specific conversation with the weather. He was aware of the smell of the lane, which in this patch, with the wet leaves of the drift released slightly by the warmth of the light falling on them, had an additional note to it, something earthy and sweet and complex, the smell of leaves returning to soil, which he had always found one of the most fundamentally comforting smells in his experience. He was aware, at a deeper level, of the feeling of having arrived somewhere, not arrived in a geographical sense. He knew this lane, knew every foot of it, but arrived in a perceptual sense. The mi'en, feeling of a thing becoming visible that had been there all along, waiting for the right conditions, the right observer, the right moment of convergence between what the world was doing and the full availability of the witnessing eye. He took out his field notebook, the smaller one, from the left overcoat pocket, which lived there through all the months of autumn and winter and spring, and wrote 3 words: the gap, white. He put the notebook away and stood in the fading light until the moment passed, the sun moving, the angle changing, the white gold quality thinning back toward ordinary amber, and then, in the way of October afternoons, ceasing quite suddenly as the direct light dropped below the horizon of the western wall. He stood for another moment in the returned ordinariness of the lane, which was itself beautiful, which was always beautiful, but which was, after what he had just seen, temporarily a different quality of beautiful. The beauty of the familiar reasserting itself after revelation, which is a more complicated and, he thought, a more truthful kind of beautiful than revelation alone. Then he walked on, toward the cottage, toward the fire, toward the evening's silence. That evening, Arthur sat in the red leather chair and read Margaret's letters by the fire. He had not read them on the walk back, as he might have done on a busier or less attentive afternoon, because the light in the gap had taken his full capacity for the rest of the walk, and he had found himself unable to give the letters what they deserved, which was his complete attention, given in the right frame of mind, in a comfortable chair, with a fire to look up at when a particular sentence required thinking about before the next could be properly received. He made the fire up first, a coal fire for the evening, the coals building on the remaining ash of the morning's wood fire, the 2 fuels creating in combination a heat that was fuller and more lasting than either alone. He set the kettle on the stove for a final cup of tea, made it, carried it to the sitting room, settled into the chair with a particular adjustment of a tall man, finding the exact configuration of limbs that a not quite large enough chair requires for complete comfort, and opened the first letter. Margaret's first letter was about a dispute between her neighbours, a matter of an apple tree whose branches crossed a property boundary, and whose apples, therefore, fell on both sides, and whose ownership was consequently a matter of some interpretive complexity. She described the dispute with a dry affection that was entirely characteristic. She liked her neighbours without expecting too much from them, which was, in Arthur's view, the only sound basis for neighbourly relations. The letter was funny in places, warm throughout, and contained at one point a description of the 2 neighbours arguing over the fence, with the tree itself as audience, standing there with its branches full of apples and its roots in both their gardens, entirely indifferent to the legal question and presumably just wanting to get on with being a tree. That made Arthur laugh quietly in the way that he laughed alone, which was a small sound and entirely genuine. The second letter was different. Margaret had written it the morning after the first, as her additional letter habit required, and it was a morning letter, written, he could tell, in the early hours, in the large, confident hand that flowed fastest when she was thinking quickly and feeling something strongly. She wrote about a morning earlier that week when she had woken at 5 o'clock. She was not accustomed to waking this early and was not ordinarily sympathetic to early mornings as a concept, and had gone to the window without knowing why, and had looked down at the town below her and had found herself unable to move away from the window for the better part of an hour. A frost had come in the year's night, and every surface of the town was white and glittering in the pre-dawn, and the streets were entirely empty, and the stillness was so complete that she had been able to hear from her window the sound of her own heartbeat. "Something happened to me," she wrote, in the large, confident hand that had not changed since she was 30 years old. "I cannot tell you what it was with any accuracy. I stood at the window, and the town was very still and very cold and very white, and I dissolved is the word, perhaps, not in a frightening way, in a perfectly quiet way, as though the boundary between me and the morning became, for a time, negotiable. Is this what you are doing, Arthur? Is this the practice you have been conducting for 11 years on your lane? Because if so, I think I have finally understood something about why you went there and why you stay." She wrote further, "I think you have been trying to tell me in your letters something that cannot be said in letters, and I think I am only now beginning to hear it. Not the words, the thing behind the words." Arthur read this paragraph very slowly and then read it again. He sat for a long time afterward, looking at the fire without reading anything further. The fire was in its later evening condition now. The coals burned down to a deep orange red, the hot core of them almost purple in the most concentrated center, the warmth radiating in the long, slow pulses that a settled fire gives, rather than the sharp surges of a new one. The room was very quiet. Outside, the lane was dark, and the elms were masses of slightly darker darkness against the November night that was already, though it was only the last week of October, beginning to make itself felt at the edges. He thought about what it meant to try to tell someone, in letters, something that could not be said in letters. He thought about the quality of a morning window in early frost. He thought about the white gold light in the canopy gap that afternoon, and about the inadequacy of the 3 words he had written in the field notebook, the gap, white, to do anything useful with what he had experienced. He thought about the accumulated practice of 11 years of attention, and whether it had produced anything that could be conveyed, and whether, if it could not be conveyed, that mattered. He thought, it matters, and it does not matter. What matters is the practice itself. The rest is gift. He picked up his pen and began, by firelight, to write back. The 1st of November came in on a morning that was colder and clearer than any morning the preceding week had offered, as though October had been holding something in reserve, and November had simply arrived and claimed it. Arthur woke to a quality of light through the curtains that was different from anything October had produced. Not brighter, but more defined, the light having the specific character of cold, clear morning light that arrives with a precision that warmer and Mistier mornings cannot manage. It was the light of a morning with nothing between it and its source. No cloud, no vapor, no residual warmth in the air to diffuse or soften. Just the cold sun rising into a cold sky and falling on a cold lane with the directness of something that has very little patience for ambiguity. He went through his morning ritual with the knowledge clearly present even before he reached the kitchen window that the lane had changed in the night. Not dramatically. Nothing dramatic happened on Wych Elm Lane, or if it did, he had not observed it in 11 years. But essentially, the nature of the change declared itself at the window. The canopy, which had been thinning through the last week of October, had reached the tipping point. The leaves that remained were now the minority, and the bare branches were now the majority. And what had been a corridor of gold was becoming a corridor of grey-brown wood with gold in it, rather than gold with wood in it. And the sky between the branches was now the primary fact of the upper view, rather than the secondary one. The lane was opening up. He stood at the kitchen window for longer than usual with his tea, watching this change settle into his understanding. He had seen it happen 9 times before, had watched the canopy reach this exact stage and pass through it in 9 previous Novembers, and it had not, through repetition, lost any of its significance. If anything, it had gained significance with each successive year. The way things that you know you will lose always become more vivid as the loss approaches, even though you also know that the loss is not a loss in any final sense, that what is being lost is only what will return. He walked the lane that morning with a different attention than the October attention. October's attention had been about abundance, about attending to the gold while it was present, registering it in all its gradations, following its changes from week to week with the care of a student following a complex argument. November's attention, by contrast, was about honesty. The lane, stripped of its autumn richness, showed what it was made of, showed its structure, showed the elm trunks and the limestone walls and the chalk path and the grey sky with a directness that summer and autumn both softened and somewhat obscured. He found he loved this version of the lane too, perhaps loved it more in some ways, the way you can love a person more fully when you see them without the elaboration of their public self, in the plainness of what they fundamentally are. He walked its full length and back, the elm trunks fully visible now, but grey-green on their northern and western faces, the lichen side, the shade side, and grey-brown on their southern and eastern faces where the bark had dried in the year's direct sun. At their bases, where the roots met the lane, the moss was the most vivid thing now in a lane that had lost its colour. Deep green, almost iridescent, the moss having thrived through autumn and continued to thrive now that the competition of the leaf canopy was removed and the filtered light that had been all it could get through summer was replaced with the direct, clear, cold light of the November sky. He crouched beside one of the great root buttresses and looked at the moss up close, the way he often crouched and looked at small things, and saw within it a complete world, the miniature stems and their perfect geometry, the dew still present among the stems at this hour, each drop magnifying the moss structure behind it into a tiny, precise landscape. He spent some time here, at this scale, and found it as nourishing as the larger view. The November lane, he thought, as he walked back to the cottage, was the lane being itself. The other seasons were the lane being beautiful. This was not a lesser thing. It was a different and perhaps more fundamental thing, and he was glad to have the temperament to receive it. On the 4th of November, a cart came down the lane. Arthur was at the kitchen window at mid-morning, his second cup of tea of the day resting on the stone sill, reading the letter he was composing in his head to Margaret before committing it to paper, a practice he had developed over years of correspondence, the mental draft allowing him to identify the sentences that needed to be thought through more carefully before the pen touched the page. When the cart appeared at the northern end of the lane, it was a large carrier's cart, the kind used for household removals, drawn by a bay horse of considerable solidity who moved through the lane with the careful, measured tread of a horse that knows it is pulling a substantial load and has decided to approach the task with appropriate deliberateness. The cart was piled high, boxes, clearly, and the shapes of wrapped furniture, and what appeared to be several trunks strapped to the cart's sides, and a rolled carpet standing upright and lashed to the rear board, and, visible above the line of boxes, the curved legs of what was probably an armchair pointing upward at the sky, with the slightly undignified air of a piece of furniture in transit. Two men walked alongside the cart, the driver and his assistant, Arthur supposed, though from this distance and in this grey November light, he could not make out much about them beyond their being men of working age, moving with the efficiency of people who have performed this same task many times. The cart stopped at the old keeper's house. Arthur set down his cup. The keeper's house had been empty for nearly 3 years. Mrs. Croft, the retired schoolmistress from Banbury, who had been its last occupant, a quiet woman of perhaps 65, whose primary conversation had been with her garden rather than with her neighbours, though she had been perfectly pleasant on the occasions when conversation was unavoidable, had left in the spring of 1881 to live with her daughter in Cheltenham, and since then the house had stood behind its wooden gate with the particular quality of emptiness that comes not from abandonment, but from good maintenance in the absence of life. Hesketh kept the roof sound and the gutters clear, but the garden had gone to its own devices, and the windows had taken on the slightly filmed quality of windows that no one opens, and the chimney had not smoked, and the gate latch had never been lifted, and Arthur had grown so accustomed to the house's vacancy that he had, without quite noticing it, stopped experiencing it as a house at all. Now the two men were carrying boxes through the gate. He watched for perhaps 20 minutes. The horse stood in the lane with the exemplary patience of a horse that has been in this situation many times and has long since made its peace with waiting. The boxes and furniture pieces disappeared through the front door one by one. No other figure appeared, no resident, no one directing operations or supervising the placement of things. Just the two men, working with practiced efficiency. He turned from the window and poured his second cup of tea, which by this point needed a moment's top-up from the still warm pot, and returned to the window. He found himself engaged in the particular mild curiosity of a person who is naturally observant and who has just discovered that his carefully understood landscape has acquired a new element, not anxious curiosity, not intrusive curiosity, but the curiosity of the naturalist who has noticed a new arrival and who understands that the proper response is patient observation over time, not premature conclusions. He did not know who was coming to live in the keeper's house, He did not need to know today. He would, at the appropriate moment and in the appropriate manner, find out. And he would find that out by the method that had served him well in all matters pertaining to the lane and its inhabitants, by paying attention and by waiting and by trusting that understanding would come when it was ready to come. He watched until the cart was fully unloaded and the two men closed the gate behind them, and the horse turned in the lane with a wide, careful arc and began its return journey north toward Nettleford, its now unloaded lightness evident in the changed rhythm of his hooves on the chalk. Then he finished his tea, put on his overcoat, and went out to split wood for the afternoon fire. He waited 4 days before calling. This was not, as he reflected on the morning of the 8th of November, while making his decision, either too long or too short. Too short would have been presumptuous, would have arrived before the new resident had found enough of her footing to receive a visitor without that visitor's presence constituting a small burden. Too long would have been cold, or would have risked appearing cold, which was a different problem. 4 days felt right. Long enough for the initial unpacking chaos to have settled, for the new resident to have slept several nights in the place and begun the process of making it theirs, and short enough that the visit arrived while the newness was still present and the welcome of a familiar face, familiar in the sense of being a face from the lane rather than from any previous acquaintance, would be genuinely useful. He dressed with a slight extra care on the morning of the 8th, which was to say, he did not dress differently, but he dressed with more attention to each element. He spent an extra moment on his collar and ensured the dark wool scarf was neatly arranged rather than simply wrapped. And he polished his boots, which he polished every Sunday evening, but which on this Wednesday morning received an additional inspection that resulted in a few extra passes of the cloth. He combed his hair, which he did every day, but which on this morning he combed twice. He looked at himself in the small glass in the hallway and decided that he looked, as he invariably looked, like a man of 61 in a good tweed overcoat, which was entirely satisfactory. He stopped at the kitchen on his way out to collect the jar of honey from Ayres's autumn batch. He had collected it from the post office 2 days before, intending it for this visit, and it sat on the kitchen shelf in its small clay jar, with its waxed cloth cover looking, he thought, like exactly the right thing to carry to a new neighbour's door. Not a bottle of wine, which would have been too much, and not simply himself, which would have been too little, but a small jar of something local and good and practically useful in the kitchen, which seemed to him the ideal calibration of a welcome gift. He walked up the lane in the grey November morning, his boots quiet on the chalk, the bare elm branches above him perfectly still in the windless cold. At the keeper's house gate, he stopped. The house looked different from 4 days ago. Not dramatically different, not measurably different, but different in the way that occupied places look different from vacant ones. A difference that has nothing to do with visible changes and everything to do with the presence of human intention. The garden, which had been a tangle of untended growth, had been worked, not transformed, but given attention. The path from the gate to the front door had been cleared of leaves. A window had been opened on the first floor and not yet closed. He opened the gate, walked up the cleared path, and knocked on the front door. He heard movement immediately, footsteps on wooden floors, the sound of something being set down carefully, and the door opened with the purposeful directness of someone who has been expecting a knock and has been ready. The woman in the doorway was perhaps 55, perhaps slightly more. It was difficult with some faces to be precise, because the kind of face that has been occupied by an active mind for a long time tends to hold its years differently from a face that has been occupied by less demanding tenants. She was angular in the cheekbones and around the jaw, her face all planes and intelligent emphasis, with dark eyes, very dark, almost black in the grey morning light, that were looking at him with an expression he could not immediately categorize. It was alert, it was cautious, it was not unfriendly, and underneath all of these, it had a quality he eventually identified after some reflection as relief. The relief of a person who has arrived somewhere new and uncertain, and who has opened the door and found on the other side of it a face that is not threatening. Her dark hair was drawn back simply, with a looseness that suggested it had been put up quickly this morning in the face of other demands. She wore a plain dark grey wool dress and a cream wool shawl across her shoulders. Indoor clothes, the clothes of someone in the middle of work. "Mr. Bellamy," she said, "I had hoped you would call." He found, as he occasionally did when caught slightly off balance, that his voice arrived a moment after he reached for it. "You have the advantage of me," he said. She smiled, a quick, precise smile, the smile of a person who smiles with their eyes first. "Hesketh," she said, "he described you quite thoroughly. The man at the end of the lane, entirely reliable, 11 years of keeping. The honey, he mentioned the honey specifically and said it was almost certain to appear." She looked at the jar in his hand with a small, genuine expression of pleasure. He was right. "He knows me rather too well," Arthur said. "I think knowing someone well is one of the things he does better than he lets on," she said, and stepped back from the door. "Come in, Mr. Bellamy. The kettle is on." Her name, she told him, as she led him through to the kitchen, was Eleanor Marsh. She had come from Oxford. The kitchen of the keeper's house, in its current state, was a landscape of careful but ongoing transformation, the kind of interior that communicates immediately to any sensitive observer the quality of the person in the process of creating it. It was not chaotic. It was not even, properly speaking, disordered. It was mid-process, which is a different condition, the condition of a person who knows what they are doing and is doing it methodically, the apparent untidiness being not the result of carelessness, but of the natural stages of a considered plan. Boxes were stacked along the south wall, but stacked in a way that indicated their contents had been considered. They were arranged by probable destination, Arthur guessed. The boxes marked for the sitting room nearest the door. The boxes marked for the bedroom furthest away. Books were in columns on the kitchen floor, but in columns that were sorted by some system. Though what system it was he could not tell, since he could not read the spines from where he stood. A large bookshelf leaned uninstalled against the wall beside the kitchen window, waiting for its moment. The kitchen itself, however, was functional. The stove was lit and working. He could feel its warmth immediately from the doorway. and the kitchen surfaces near the stove were organized with the domestic pragmatism of someone who has decided that the kitchen, whatever else remains uncertain, must be operational, because a person cannot do anything else worth doing without the support of a working kitchen. The kettle on the stove was already steaming. There were 2 cups. She had expected him, or at least expected someone, set on the cleared section of the kitchen table. She moved through the kitchen with the particular ease of a woman who had been making tea in various kitchens for a long time and who could perform the operation without breaking the thread of conversation. He pulled out one of the wooden chairs that had been cleared for the purpose and sat, setting his hat on his knee and his stick against the table leg, and watched her pour the tea with the same quiet attentiveness he brought to the lane. Eleanor Marsh had come from Oxford, from the city itself, she clarified, with a mild but deliberate distinction, rather than from the university. She had spent 20 years as the principal librarian at the Beaufort Library, a private subscription library on the Banbury Road that served a membership of professional and academic people, and which had been, in her tenure, expanded and improved to a point that she considered with a satisfaction that was real but not immodest. She had retired that spring following an illness the previous winter that she described as a prolonged and tedious inconvenience, with a kind of brisk self-deprecation that he recognized as the language of someone who had been quite seriously unwell and who had decided, for entirely reasonable reasons, not to make the illness the primary fact of their recent biography. She had been, before the illness, a person who had rarely been still. She said this not as a confession or a complaint, but as a piece of accurate autobiography. She had been, she said, constitutionally inclined toward activity, toward the management of complex systems, toward the satisfaction of things being well ordered and correctly running. The library had been an ideal outlet for this constitution. It had also, she thought, been something of a trap, a very pleasant trap, a trap she would have stayed in willingly, but a trap nonetheless, in that it had given her no reason ever to stop, and had not, in 20 years, taught her how. Stopping was not voluntary, she said, of the illness. It was imposed. And the lane? Arthur asked. She looked at him across the table with the dark eyes that he was beginning to understand were not quite as guarded as they had first appeared, but were simply the eyes of a person who looked directly at things. I walked through Nettleford 15 years ago, she said, on a walking holiday, with a friend who has since moved to Edinburgh and whom I see rarely. It was October. The lane was... She paused, looking for a word that seemed to evade her slightly. It was not like anything else I had seen. The light in it. I thought it was the season. I thought, if I came back in any other season, it would be ordinary. And if you had come in any other season, I don't think it would have been ordinary, she said. I think it is never ordinary. No, he agreed. She had written to Hesketh in March. The reply had come within a week. The house was available. The rent was reasonable. And the reference to Hesketh, knowing of Arthur and to Arthur's suitability as a neighbour, had been in the second paragraph, as though it were itself a selling point. They drank their tea. The stove sent its warmth evenly through the kitchen. Through the kitchen window, the bare elm lane received the grey November light with the same patient acceptance it had received every quality of light for centuries. And in the partially unpacked keeper's house, in the warmth of a properly working stove and the presence of two people who were discovering, quietly and without any rush, that they were likely to understand each other, something was beginning that had no particular name, but that was entirely clear. In the weeks that followed Eleanor's arrival, Arthur became aware of a change in his experience of the lane that he had not anticipated, and that he found, on reflection, entirely logical. The logic of it being the kind of logic you only understand after the fact, when the thing that has changed makes its change clear. He had not known, before Eleanor came to the keeper's house, that he had been watching the lane as a solitary witness. He had simply watched it, had believed himself to be watching it with the full attention it deserved, and had been correct in this belief as far as it went. But a lane with one witness and a lane with two witnesses are, it turned out, different lanes in some important sense, not because the lane itself changes, but because the act of witnessing is affected by the knowledge that it is also being conducted by another person, somewhere along the same length of the same landscape. He noticed this first on a morning when he was at the northern bench, and he saw Eleanor walking the lane from the south end, working northward at her characteristic pace, which was, he had observed by now, somewhat faster than his own, and which had the quality of walking as problem-solving rather than walking as noticing, the pace of a mind that was still partly convinced that speed was an appropriate response to most things. He watched her come up the lane from the bench, watched her noticing the things she noticed. She stopped at the gap in the canopy, though not for as long as he would have, and she put her hand on the trunk of the third elm on the western side, which was the one he had named in his notebook for its particular lean, which meant she had noticed the lean-to. And he found that watching someone else walk the lane added an entire additional dimension of information to his understanding of it. He could see, from this distance, what the lane presented to a walker coming from the south in the morning light that he could not see from inside his own experience of walking from the south in the morning light. He could see the way the light changed at specific points along the length, a brightening at the gap, a deepening shade below the third elm, a particular angle of the chalk path's reflection near the hollow bowl where the rain collected. He could see these things because he was not inside them, but beside them, watching them operate on another person. He noticed also that Eleanor's walks were changing. In the first weeks after her arrival, her pace had been uniformly quick, the speed of a person who has been busy for a long time and whose body has not yet been informed that the busyness is over. By the middle of November, the pace on the return journey was consistently slower than the pace on the outward journey. By the last week of November, the outward journey had also slowed, and she was stopping more, at the gap, at the stile, at the point where the lane dipped into the shallow bowl, for longer than she had in the first week. The lane was doing what it did. It was calibrating her. It was doing to her, in a matter of weeks, what it had done to Arthur over a matter of years, the difference in speed being perhaps attributable to the different circumstances of their arrivals. He had come in a state of gradual and voluntary deceleration, she in a state of enforced stop following prolonged motion, and the enforced stop had perhaps made her more immediately receptive to what the lane was offering. He said something of this to her on one of the Sunday afternoons she had taken to spending at the cottage, which had become, without either of them having arranged it or even consciously agreed to it, the kind of arrangement that establishes itself through the logic of proximity and affinity, rather than through any deliberate decision, a regular feature of both their weeks. She came on Sunday afternoons with her work bag, which contained whatever she happened to be reading that week, and she sat in the second chair, a plain wooden chair that he had placed across the fire from the red leather one in the early weeks of her visits, and read or talked as the afternoon required, and the fire burned between them, and the early winter afternoon darkened around the cottage with its usual November efficiency. "It is faster than I expected," she said when he mentioned the calibration. "You were ready," he said. "You had been ready for some time, I think. The lane simply provided the conditions." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the fire. She had the habit, which he found entirely congenial, of being silent after something that required thinking about, rather than responding at once with the first formulation that offered itself. "Relearning is not the same as learning," she said, finally. "It is both easier and harder. Easier because some part of you knows the destination, knows in some cellular or instinctive way that this is where you were always going to arrive. Harder because you have to make peace with the fact that it took you this long." He thought about this. "I don't think the long way round is a waste," he said. "I think you couldn't have arrived here without the long way. The library, the work, all of it. It's what you brought here. It's in how you look at things." She looked at him. "And what is it that you brought here?" she said. 11 years ago. What did you bring?" He considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "Latin," he said, finally, which made her laugh. And then, the habit of paying attention to things that would otherwise go unrecorded, which I learned from boys trying to avoid learning. Latin, and which is, I suppose, the same thing as what you do with a library, making sure that things that exist are not lost. It was during this period of November, when the lane had reached its most austere and honest self, that Arthur arrived at the word he had been searching for since the afternoon of the canopy gap. He had been working toward it for 3 weeks. He had written around it in both his field notebook and his sitting room notebook, approaching from the angles of description, then of association, then of comparison, and had found each time that he reached the edge of the thing but could not quite arrive at its center. The thing he was trying to name was the quality of the lane that made it feel different from other places, not just visually or audibly different, but different in some deeper register, in the way that certain places make themselves felt as distinct from other places in a manner that has nothing to do with their objective features, and everything to do with what they have accumulated over time. He had tried depth, not quite right; history, too formal, too abstract; memory, closer, but memory was too individual, too personal. What the lane had was not any one person's memory of it. It was something more collective and less conscious than that. He was thinking about this on a cold Thursday morning in the third week of November while performing the task of splitting wood in the backyard, a task that occupied his hands and body completely while leaving his mind in the free-running state it sometimes achieved through physical repetition, the state in which thoughts arrived not as products of deliberate reasoning, but as things that had already thought themselves and were simply making themselves known. He set a piece of oak on the block. He raised the axe. He split the oak with one clean stroke that came as much from the wrist as from the shoulder. The techniques of an experienced splitter who has learned to use the wood's own grain rather than fighting it. The two halves fell apart, and as they fell, the word arrived, accumulated, not accumulated as in stored, not accumulated as in simply added up, accumulated in the sense that a place that has been inhabited and walked and tended and witnessed by many people over many years comes to hold something of all that presence, comes to carry in its atmosphere, in the specific quality of its silence and its light and its relationship to time, the residue of all that patient human engagement. Not ghosts, not anything so dramatic, simply the physical fact of long human presence, expressed as a quality of the air, a texture of the silence, a depth to the ordinary experience of being in the lane that you did not get in a place that had been less attended to over a shorter period. He stood with the axe in his hands and the two split halves of the oak at his feet and thought about this for some time. He thought about the Roman road beneath the lane and about all the people who had walked the lane above it since the road was laid down, and about how each one of them had added something, not deliberately, not consciously, but simply to the act of presence, through being in that place with whatever quality of attention they had available to what the lane had become. He thought about the particular quality of the lane's silence in the early mornings, which was not simply the absence of sound, but a specific kind of silence that felt inhabited, occupied, a silence that was doing something rather than simply being the default state in the absence of noise. He thought about Eleanor, who had walked into this accumulated place 3 weeks ago from a life of entirely different accumulations, and who was already unmistakably beginning to feel it. He could see it in the changing tempo of her walks, in the way she had begun to stop at specific places rather than walking past them, in the way her face looked on Sunday afternoons by the fire, less like the face of a person who has stopped, and more like the face of a person who has arrived. He set the axe against the woodpile. He picked up the split pieces and stacked them with the others. He went inside to write the word in his notebook before it became something else. Eleanor brought her brother on the Sunday of the third week of November. Arthur had heard them on the lane before he saw them. Two voices arriving from the direction of the keeper's house at a distance that made the words inaudible, but the quality of the exchange perfectly clear. It was an easy exchange, a conversation between people who had been having conversations with each other for long enough that the scaffolding of social performance was entirely absent. Occasional speech, substantial pauses, the kind of walking and talking that is really walking with occasional talking, the conversation a subsidiary activity to the shared physical experience of the lane. He was at the northern bench with his book and the blanket across his knees. He had taken to bringing the blanket in the last week, the November cold having established itself at a depth that made sitting still for any length of time without additional warmth an increasingly committed act. When they appeared from the southern end of the lane, walking northward, Eleanor he recognized immediately by her coat and her pace, which had now settled into something considerably closer to the lane's own tempo, still faster than Arthur's, but with the stops built in now, the stops that were the lane's specific requirement for anyone who wished to walk it well. The person beside her was a man of approximately Arthur's own age, or perhaps a year or two older. It was difficult to tell with some faces, and this was a face that wore its age with a kind of equanimity that made the specific number seem less relevant than the general fact of a well-occupied life. He was shorter than Arthur by perhaps 3 inches, which put him at medium height, and he was built more broadly, with a roundness in his face and a solidity in his frame that suggested someone who had spent years sitting with other people in small rooms. The particular physical quality of people whose work is conducted mainly through conversation and whose bodies have accommodated themselves to the demands of long, attentive listening. He wore a long coat of dark green wool, deeply weathered and clearly well loved, and a hat of soft grey felt, a practical working hat, not a formal one. And he walked with his hands loosely at his sides rather than behind his back or in his pockets, a way of walking that spoke of easy physical comfort in the external world. He was looking at the elm branches above the lane as he walked, which Arthur noticed before he noticed anything else about him. The upward gaze of someone who has arrived somewhere and has immediately found what they needed to look at, which was a quality that Arthur recognized as the mark of a person with a genuine relationship with the outside world rather than a merely polite one. Eleanor introduced him at the bench. Her brother, Dr. James Marsh, retired, formerly of a London practice of 30 years. James Marsh looked at Arthur with the eyes of a man who has spent 30 years learning to see what other people present rather than only what they show. They were quiet eyes, grey-brown, slightly deep-set in the round face, and they looked at you with an interest that was entirely genuine and entirely non-invasive. The interest of someone who is curious about people without requiring anything from them. "Miss Marsh has spoken of you," he said, offering his hand. His voice was measured and unhurried, the voice of a man accustomed to choosing his words in rooms where words mattered, with that particular accuracy that suggests the original matches the description quite closely. "I hope that is not alarming," Arthur said. "On the contrary," James said, "she describes someone who listens well. In my experience, that is a quality rare enough to be remarkable in itself." They began, without any discussion of doing so, to walk southward together down the lane. The 3 of them moved at a pace that found its own natural common denominator, which was slower than Eleanor's usual pace and approximately equal to Arthur's. And the conversation they had as they walked was the kind of conversation that walking on a lane produces: unhurried, non-linear, spacious, with room in it for what was not said as well as what was. The bare elms above them were perfectly still in the cold November afternoon. The lane received their footsteps and their voices and held both with equal equanimity, as it always had, and as it always would. The three of them had tea at the cottage that afternoon, gathered around the small table in the sitting room that Arthur rarely used for company, because company was an infrequent event, which made the afternoon feel like a small, pleasant deviation from the established pattern of things. He had built the fire up to something more generous than his usual solo afternoon fire. Not consciously, or not entirely consciously, the hands sometimes made these adjustments without consulting the mind, and it was only when he noticed the fire burning with an unusual warmth and fullness that he understood what he had done and found it appropriate. Eleanor sat in the wooden chair that had become her Sunday chair. James sat in the third chair, which was a plain ladder back from the kitchen that Arthur had brought through for the occasion, and which James received with the uncomplaining ease of a man who has sat in every variety of chair in 30 years of clinical rooms and has long since ceased to have preferences about furniture. The tea things were on the small table between them: the teapot, the cups, the milk jug, the plate of plain biscuits that Arthur baked on Saturday mornings from a recipe his mother had given him that he had never seen any reason to improve. The fire was between the chairs and the window, and its warmth moved through the room with the particular quality of warmth from a coal and wood combination fire, even, deep, sustained. James Marsh drank tea with the straightforward pleasure of a man who had spent 30 years in a profession that gave him most of his pleasures in brief windows between demanding circumstances, and who had therefore learned to be fully present in pleasant moments without any residue of urgency. He held his cup in both hands, as Arthur did, which Arthur noticed with the mild satisfaction of recognizing a habit you had thought was peculiar to yourself. He talked about London when Eleanor asked him to, not effusively, not with the compulsive detail of someone performing the narrative of their life, but with the selective honesty of someone who has enough distance on the experience now to see it clearly and say only what is true and interesting. He had practiced in a neighborhood between Islington and the older eastern parts of the city, a neighborhood of tradespeople and small manufacturers and domestic servants and the families of junior clerks, people whose relationship with the medical profession was complicated by the economics of consulting it, and who had therefore developed a range of practical strategies for managing their health without it. He had admired these strategies. He had also spent 30 years trying to be worth consulting, which was, he said, the more useful ambition than trying to be impressive. "What do you learn?" he said, setting his cup down and looking at the fire with the expression of a man looking at something he has thought about a great many times. In a practice of that kind, over that length of time, is that most of what you can give most people costs nothing that medicine has in its kit. It costs time, and it costs the ability to be genuinely present, to be there, actually there, in the room with that specific person and their specific situation, rather than processing them through a template of presenting complaints and protocols. He paused. The fire settled slightly, a coal shifting and resettling with a small, bright sound. "Being heard," he said. "That is the one I come back to consistently. After 30 years, that is what I find myself returning to as the thing most people needed and most often did not receive. Not to be treated or cured or advised, to be heard, to have someone be sufficiently present with them that they felt in the body, not merely understood in the mind, that they existed, that their experience was real. Arthur looked at the fire. He thought of the lane, which heard everything that moved through it. Every boot, every voice, every shift of weather and season, and which had been hearing things for centuries without requiring any of it to be anything other than what it was. It costs almost nothing, James continued, to give someone that, and yet it is the scarcest thing. Yes, Arthur said, that seems entirely right. Eleanor was looking at the fire too, and he thought he understood what she was thinking. That the library had been, in its way, the same practice, the same work of presence and availability, and that what she had learned in 20 years of making books available to people was not entirely different from what James had learned in 30 years of making himself available to people, and not entirely different from what Arthur had learned in 11 years of making his attention available to Elaine. I think, Eleanor said, that this might be what draws us all to the same place. The fire agreed, or seemed to, settling again with a long, warm sound. James Marsh walked the lane every morning of his week's visit. Arthur knew this, not because they had discussed it, or because James had mentioned it, but because the evidence was there each morning in the chalk, boot prints, somewhat wider in the ball than Arthur's own narrower prints, leading northward from the keeper's house gate and returning with slight variations in the line of the return journey that spoke of a man who was not retracing his steps with mechanical fidelity, but was allowing the return walk to be its own thing, noticing what the northward walk had prepared him to notice when he reversed. On the third morning of the visit, a Thursday, clear and cold, with a specific quality of late November clear sky mornings that was quite different from October's clear sky mornings, being harder and more precise and less golden, the light having none of October's warmth in it, but having instead a purity that October, for all its richness, did not possess. They encountered each other at the stone stile. They had both arrived at it from different directions at approximately the same moment, which produced an instant of mutual recognition that was slightly comic in the way of things that are unexpected but not unwelcome. They stood on either side of the stile, both of them having stopped simultaneously, and there was a moment of acknowledged coincidence before the stile made itself available as a leaning post for both of them, and they fell naturally into a companionable silence. The lane was very quiet. The cold was very complete. Arthur's breath and James's breath made separate small clouds in the still air, each one forming and dissipating at its own pace, the two rhythms slightly different from each other, as breathing rhythms always are between individuals. "Do you hear that?" James said, after a time that might have been 3 minutes or 6. Arthur listened. He had been listening already, as he always listened at the stile. But he reoriented his attention toward whatever James was hearing, which was different from listening for the things he himself was listening for and required a slight recalibration. From Ashmore Wood, some distance away, the bare winter branches of the wood visible over the field wall as a dark, complex lattice against the pale sky. A sound arrived on the cold, still air, very thin, very clear. 4 notes ascending, then a pause, then 3 notes in a different pattern, more exploratory than the first phrase. "A thrush," Arthur said when he was certain. song thrush rather than missile thrush. The missile thrush sings higher and with longer pauses. This one is working through phrases. James was quiet for a moment, listening to the next phrase. It came 5 notes this time, the middle note slightly different from any in the previous phrases, the bird testing a variation. I heard birds in London, James said. House sparrows, predominantly, pigeons, the occasional starling, but hearing them as... He paused, the pause of a man who does not use language carelessly, as presences, as specific individuals doing specific things in specific places for specific reasons. That is new to me. Or rather, it is old, and I had ceased to practice it. One regains it quickly, Arthur said, more quickly than one expects. The lane helps. The lane insists, Arthur said, and was gratified to see James's round face take on the expression of a man who has heard something that arrives precisely where it was needed. The thrush sang again from Ashmore Wood. The longest phrase yet, 7 or 8 notes, a phrase that had the quality of arrival, of something found rather than sought, the confidence of a bird that has discovered what it wanted to say. And the cold, still air carried the phrase the full distance from the wood to the stile, without losing a single note, and both men heard it whole. They stood at the stile for another long time after the thrush had finished, as though the silence that followed the song were itself worth attending to, which it was. On the Saturday evening, the last full evening of James's visit, he came to the cottage to say goodbye and to share the final glass of port that had become, over the course of the week, an established evening ritual. Eleanor came also, and the 3 of them sat in the sitting room in what had become already a familiar arrangement around the fire. Arthur had built the fire up to the same generosity as the Sunday afternoon. He had also, without making a particular ceremony of it, decanted the port into the good glass decanter, rather than pouring directly from the bottle, and he had put the proper port glasses on the table rather than the everyday ones. He was not sure why he had done this. There was no audience for the gesture beyond himself and the occasion, but it had seemed right, and he trusted the instinct. James received his glass with a look that suggested he had noticed and appreciated the small formality. Eleanor received hers and wrapped both hands around the stem in a gesture that was more about warmth than about wine, and looked at the fire with an expression that Arthur was beginning to recognize as her thinking face, the face she wore when she was working something out rather than reporting it. I had not expected this, James said, after they had sat in silence for a time that was comfortable. What specifically? Eleanor asked. He turned the glass in his hands, the effect of the place. I came because you asked and because London has ceased, of late, to make particularly strong demands on my presence. I came without any large expectation. I thought it would be pleasant. He paused. It has been more than pleasant. What has it been? Arthur asked, though he thought he knew. It has been restorative, James said, in the proper sense of that word. Not relaxing or diverting or enjoyable, though it has been all of those, but restorative in the sense of having put something back that I had not known was missing. A kind of... He paused again, looking for the word with the careful patience of a man who knew what careless words cost. A kind of permission to be slow, to hear, a thrush from across a field, and regard it as sufficient activity for the morning to sit by a fire with no agenda. He looked at Arthur. "You have been doing this for 11 years. "Yes," Arthur said. "And it continues to." "Every morning," Arthur said, "without exception. The lane does not offer the same thing twice, which means the attention never grows stale. And the attention, kept fresh, keeps everything else in order." James nodded slowly. "I shall come again," he said. "Eleanor has suggested Christmas, if you would have both of us." "I would have both of you," Arthur said, "with very great pleasure." The fire between them was deep now. The evening fire, the coals burned to their most stable and sustained heat. The warmth it produced even and unfailing, the sound of it a low, continuous, barely there whisper that had the quality of something breathing slowly in sleep. The three of them sat in this warmth and did not need to say much more, having said what was necessary. Outside, the November lane was very dark and very still. The bare elms stood in the dark, with the calm authority of things that had been standing in the dark for a very long time and had no objection to continuing. The cold that the stone walls held out was real and deep, and it made the warmth inside more fully itself by virtue of the contrast. The way silence makes sound more audible, and stillness makes movement more vivid, and all the opposites of things make the things themselves more legible. Arthur sat in the red chair and watched the fire and felt, in the simple warmth of the room and the presence of these two people and the knowledge of the lane just outside the window, that the evening was exactly what an evening should be. December came in on a note of sustained and unusual quietness. Arthur had lived through 11 Decembers on the lane and had learned that December was the most variable of the winter months, capable of sharp frosts and driving rain and the particular, aggressive grey of Thames Valley cold, but also capable of weeks of dry, still, crystalline weather that had the quality of a held breath, the world pausing before committing to the depth of winter. This December appeared to be choosing the latter. It arrived dry and cold and still, and it maintained this stillness through its first 2 weeks with a consistency that had about it something almost deliberate, as though the weather had made a decision and was comfortable with it. The lane in December was a different thing from the lane in November, though both were bare and winter cold and open to the sky. The difference, one, of relationship. November's lane was a lane in the process of becoming its winter self, still arriving, still shedding, still adjusting to the change. December's lane had arrived. It was settled into winter, the way a person settles into a long journey, past the adjustment period, past the moment of decision, simply and completely in the thing. He walked it every morning and found, each morning, that it gave him what it always gave him, and also something he had not expected, a particular sharpness of detail that the December clear cold produced in everything it touched. The lichen on the elm bark was more vivid in the December light than in any other light, and the specific geometry of the moss at the tree roots was more precise, and the pale surface of the chalk path was more defined, and the sky between the bare branches was more emphatically itself, the specific December blue, which was entirely different from the October blue and the summer blue, a blue that had been refined and concentrated by the removal of everything that was not essential. He thought often in these December mornings about the word he had found in November, accumulated. He had written about it in his notebook at length, 3 full pages on a December Sunday morning when the lane was too cold even for him to remain outside for longer than 30 minutes, sitting in the red leather chair, with the coal fire providing the warmth the outside was withholding, filling pages with the exploration of what the word meant and where it pointed. He had arrived, in those pages, at something he had not quite been expecting. He had written about accumulation as the lane's quality, the lane as a vessel of concentrated human presence over centuries, and had then turned the question around and asked what he was accumulating, not on the lane, but in himself through the practice. What was the consequence of 11 years of this specific kind of attention? What had it made in him that would not have been made otherwise? He sat with this question for some time without writing. Then he wrote, "The capacity to be present, not as a philosophical position or an achieved state, but as a practiced ability, the way a muscle is developed by consistent use. The practice of attention, sustained over years, does not produce knowledge of the world so much as it produces a particular quality of relationship with the world, a quality of being genuinely here, genuinely in this specific moment, in this specific place, rather than elsewhere in time or intention, while occupying this particular point in space." He read this back and thought it was approximately right. Then he added, "And this quality, once developed, is not confined to the lane. It accompanies you everywhere you go. It is what makes the simple things, a cup of tea, a fire, a letter from Margaret, an unexpected conversation with a person whose mind works at a congenial pace, feel not adequate, but abundant. The world attended to is larger than the world that is not attended to." He closed the notebook. He looked at the fire. He was, he thought, becoming slightly philosophical in his old age, which was either a natural development of the preceding 61 years, or a sign that the December stillness was getting into him more deeply than was strictly prudent. He decided it was the former, which was clearly the right answer, and went to make more tea. Eleanor's settling in progressed through November and into December with a gradual, unhurried thoroughness that Arthur observed. From the lane, from the kitchen window, from the respectful peripheral attention of a good neighbour, with considerable and uncomplicated appreciation. Her books went onto shelves in the second week of November. She had built the shelves herself over the course of 2 weekends, with a combination of methodical persistence and occasional consultation of the instruction that the lumber merchant in Nettleford had written on a piece of paper, and which she had found more useful than she had expected. He had offered to help both times she had been building, and she had declined both times with a courtesy that he understood perfectly, which was the courtesy of a person who knows that the installation of one's own books in one's own place is one of the few acts that must be performed entirely alone, because it is also the act of arranging one's mind in the space, and one's mind can only be arranged by oneself. He could see from the lane on his evening walks the thin winter dark of December, making the keeper's house windows into small yellow rectangles of warmth against the cold, the shapes of the bookshelves through the drawn curtains, and the slight alteration in the visual character of those windows that the presence of books produces in any room. A room with bookshelves has a different quality of light for a room without them. The spines absorb the lamplight and return it differently. The textures and colors of bound books, creating a visual warmth that is not accounted for by the light source alone, and that makes any room containing them feel slightly more inhabited than the same room would feel without them. She planted bulbs in the first week of December. He saw this from the lane. She was in the garden in the cold morning, crouched over the border, working with a trowel in the methodical way of someone who has done this before and knows exactly what they are doing. The bulbs she planted, he could not see which, but the depth she was planting at suggested tulips, perhaps narcissus, would not show themselves for 4 months, and the flowers they would produce were in a sense entirely hypothetical, the flowers of a season that had not yet arrived in a garden she had not yet had long enough to know. This act of faith, the planting of things in December for April's flowering in a garden still largely unknown, moved Arthur more than he could easily explain. He thought about it afterward and decided that what moved him was its implicit statement about the relationship between the planting self and the reaping self, the acknowledgement that the person who would see these flowers in April was not quite the same person who was crouching over this cold border in December, and that the December person was willing, was in fact eager, to plant for the benefit of the April person nonetheless. It was a form of generosity toward one's own future self that seemed to him one of the most quietly brave things a person could do. He wrote about it in his notebook that evening. Then he added a paragraph about a letter he had received from Margaret that morning, in which she had written about the frost that had come to Ludlow in the previous week, and about standing at her window at 5 in the morning, watching the town go from dark to silver to grey-pink as the frost caught the first light. I stood there for 40 minutes, she wrote, which is 40 minutes more than I have ever previously stood still at 5 in the morning for any purpose. I thought about you, Arthur. I thought about what it would be like to be you standing at a lane in Oxfordshire and watching the same kind of thing every morning for 11 years. I think I am beginning to understand that it is not the watching that is the practice. It is the willingness to be changed by what you see. He set the letter on his knee and looked at the fire and thought. She had understood it more completely than he had articulated it to her, which was the mark of a genuinely acute mind arriving at a destination before the map it was following had quite gotten there. He wrote back immediately before the fire had burned down, because he did not want to lose the specific quality of what he felt in reading her letter, which was the quality of being understood across a distance, of the thing that was most important about his life being received and recognized by the person he most wanted to have receive and recognize it. The frost came on the night of the 19th of December. Arthur knew it was coming before it arrived. He had been aware through the preceding day of a quality in the cold that was different from the sustained dry cold of the early December weeks, a quality that had more edge to it, more intention, as though the cold had decided to make a more definitive statement than the one it had been making. He had mentioned this to no one, since there was no one in the habit of asking him about such things except Eleanor, and she had not called that afternoon. He had simply noted it in his field notebook. Cold has changed quality. Hard frost likely tonight, and gone to bed without any particular concern, because frost was not concerning, and because there was nothing to be done about it in any case. He woke to a quality of light through the curtains that was entirely unlike anything the preceding weeks had produced. It was not the pale grey of early dawn, and it was not the pale gold of early morning. It was something between both and beyond both, a brilliance that was cold rather than warm, a luminosity that came not from the sun, but from the reflected light of frost on every surface of the world outside the window simultaneously. He went to the window without dressing first, which was unusual, and looked out. The lane had been remade in the night. The chalk surface, which had in unfrozen form the soft grey-white of old chalk, was now hard and pale and glittering under the pre-dawn sky. Every slight irregularity of the surface outlined in frost crystal each pebble and chalk flint and compressed leaf fragment, now a distinct and precise object, the soft surface of the lane having been replaced by something that looked carved, defined, exactly itself. The elm bark was whitened along its northern and western exposures, where the moisture in the bark had frozen at the surface, the white of the frost following every furrow of the bark in a map of the bark's own structure. The dead grass at the lane's edges was upright and glittering, each blade individual and distinct, coated in crystals that caught the pre-dawn sky and scattered it into tiny cold fires, and the sky itself, the sky above the bare elm branches, was the colour that winter clear nights produce just before the dawn, a deep, saturated, impossibly precise blue that had no equivalent in any other sky Arthur had seen in any other season. He stood at the window for a long time before dressing. Then he dressed, fully, carefully, with every layer appropriate to a hard frost, and went out through the front gate onto the lane. The cold took his breath with an immediacy and completeness that even his prepared attention was surprised by. Not aggressive, not painful, simply total. The cold was everywhere at once, claiming every surface of him, entering his lungs with each breath as a clean, sharp mineral thing. The air in his lungs on the exhale, producing a visible cloud that hung in the still air for a moment before dissipating. The sound of his boots on the frozen chalk was completely different from anything the unfrozen surface had ever produced, sharp and ringing, a sound that carried in the cold, still air with a clarity that made every step seem emphatic and deliberate. He stood in the frozen lane and looked at the length of it, and was, for several continuous seconds, simply stopped. He had seen this before. He had seen this, or something like it, in each of the 11 winters he had spent on the lane. He had never become accustomed to it. He had never found that repetition diminished it. It arrived each time as though it were the first time, not because the lane had forgotten him, or he had forgotten the lane, but because the specific configuration of that morning's frost, that morning's sky, that morning's quality of pre-dawn light, and that morning's particular silence was unique and had never existed before and would not exist again, and therefore could not be experienced as something remembered, only as something present. He breathed. He looked. He was here, in this moment, on this lane, in this extraordinary and ordinary morning. He stayed for quite a long time, but when he finally went back indoors, his hands were so cold they had difficulty managing the latch, and he was not sorry. James arrived on the afternoon of Christmas Eve on the carrier's cart from Abingdon, which met the Nettleford Road at the crossroads east of the village, and which he had arranged with characteristic practicality to bring him directly to the lane's northern entrance so that he would not need to carry his bag through the village. Arthur and Eleanor were both at the northern end of the lane when they heard the cart. They had been walking the lane together in the pale December afternoon, as had become their comfortable habit on clear afternoons, and they stood at the bench and watched the cart come down the road with the particular pleasure of two people who have been expecting something good and are now seeing it arrive. James descended from the cart with the deliberate care of a man who has been sitting for 3 hours and is negotiating with his body's reasonable objections to continued movement. He had his leather bag over one shoulder and, against explicit instructions, a bottle of brandy under one arm and a paper-wrapped parcel under the other that turned out, when it was unwrapped later, to contain a quantity of candied orange peel from a specific shop in London that he had patronized for so many years it had the status of a domestic institution. "I said nothing," Arthur reminded him, accepting the brandy. "You did say nothing," James agreed, handing the parcel to Eleanor. "Quite clearly. But I found that Christmas was an insufficiently compelling exception." "It is Christmas," Eleanor said, which settled the matter. The three of them walked the lane southward in the late afternoon light, the low December sun casting the longest shadows Arthur had seen in any year on the lane, the elm trunks projecting shadows so long that they crossed the full width of the lane and reached the opposite wall, shadows that had the precise and decorative quality of pattern rather than mere shadow. James walked between Eleanor and Arthur with the air of someone who has arrived at the right place at the right time and is entirely aware of both facts. He walked more slowly than he had on his first visit. Arthur noticed this without remarking on it. The November visit had calibrated something in James that the December visit was inheriting. He walked at the lane's pace now, with the stops built in. He stopped at the stone stile without any prompting and stood at it for a minute, looking across the frost-edged field toward Ashmore Wood, and Arthur had the impression, which he could not have justified, but which he trusted, that James was listening for the thrush, whose late November song had now fallen silent, but whose absence was itself audible to a person who had heard it. They came to the keeper's house in the fading light of the December afternoon. The sun had set behind the western wall before they reached it, and the sky above the bare canopy was moving through its rapid December progression from pale gold to deep amber to the first grey blue of early dusk. The keeper's house had been prepared by Eleanor with a thoroughness and care that produced, on entering, the specific feeling of a house that has been made ready by someone who knows what making ready means. There were tallow candles in the windows, real ones, not the paraffin ones increasingly available, which she had refused as a matter of preference, and their light transformed the windows of the house into small warm lanterns visible from the lane. The fire had been lit in both the kitchen and the sitting room, and the dual warmth was present in every corner. Holly and ivy from the wood were on the mantelpiece, dark green and waxy in the candle and firelight, and the smell of the house was the smell of a house that is keeping Christmas. The resin of the holly the smoke of the fires, the faint sweetness of dried orange peel, and something baked. Arthur looked around the keeper's house, which 3 weeks ago had been a landscape of careful mid-process unpacking, and found it entirely itself, not finished. A house is never finished, in the sense that a solved problem is finished, but arrived. Christmas Day on Wych Elm Lane was the quietest and, by Arthur's personal measure, the finest Christmas he could remember having had. He walked the lane at first light, as he always walked it, as he would always walk it, because the lane on Christmas morning was not less worthy of his attention than the lane on any other morning, and was, in fact, particularly worthy of it, for the reason that it was different. Christmas Day being one of the few mornings in the year when the world beyond the lane had collectively decided to be still. The Nettleford Road entirely quiet, the village entirely quiet, the farms in their brief seasonal pause, so that the lane's own sounds arrived with an unusual clarity, nothing else competing with them. A new frost had come in the night, lighter than the 19th's, hard frost, a gentle frost, the kind that dusts the world rather than encasing it, laying down a thin sparkling suggestion of white over the surfaces already cold from the weeks of cold that had preceded it. The lane in this light frost had a different quality from the hard frosted lane of the 19th, softer, more tentative, as though December were working from memory of what the lane could be, rather than at full commitment. He walked the full length and back in silence that was profound and various. The silence had layers to it. Christmas morning silence, being a different beast from ordinary morning silence, carrying within it the accumulated quiet of a settled and familiar world, at rest, in a way it rarely allowed itself to be. He thought of his father, who had walked on Christmas morning as a matter of long-standing and unexplained habit, taking the same route through the Shropshire lanes each year with the same single-minded attention, and who had never explained why and had never needed to. He returned to the cottage and read for 2 hours Gilbert White's Natural History of Selborne, the 4th reading, the text more familiar now than on any previous encounter, and therefore more fully itself. The observations that had once required concentration now arriving with the ease of things remembered rather than learned, and the things remembered having, in the remembering, deepened beyond what any first encounter could have given them. He arrived at the keeper's house at midday with the modest contribution Eleanor had asked him to bring: the last of his stored apples, a jar of the heir's honey, and a bottle of good claret he had been keeping for an occasion that would justify it. The meal Eleanor had prepared was simple in the particular way of meals prepared by someone who has genuine confidence in their ability. Not simple as a concession to limited means or limited time, but simple as an expression of certainty about what the occasion needed and what it didn't. A roasted bird, root vegetables, a sauce that smelled of bay, and something deeper, bread she had baked that morning, still slightly warm, and for afterward, a pudding that had been made on the last Sunday of November, as puddings ought to be, and which had spent 3 weeks developing its character in the back of her larder. They sat over the meal for most of the afternoon, which was right. They talked about many things. James about his London years, with the candour and unhurried comedy of a man who has had time to achieve proportion. Eleanor about the library with the affection of someone describing a place genuinely loved. Arthur less than either, but with the particular quality of contribution that comes from someone who listens well and speaks when they have something to add, rather than simply to fill the air. The pale December light moved through its brief arc outside the windows, going from the low noon angle to the early dusk that December managed by 4 o'clock. And the three of them were entirely inside the warmth and the food and the conversation, and did not, for the length of that afternoon, need anything that was not present. On the day after Christmas, the 26th, a Thursday, the day the village called Boxing Day, and which had always seemed to Arthur more interesting than Christmas itself, being the day after the ceremony, and therefore free of ceremony's demands, Arthur and James walked the lane alone. They had not arranged this, or not precisely. Eleanor had mentioned at breakfast that she intended to spend the morning with a book she had been promising herself since her arrival, and which she had been, with characteristic self-discipline, postponing until she had earned it. Both men had understood entirely, and felt perhaps a mild private relief, which neither of them would have mentioned, that a morning of their own was available to them. They had put on their coats and gone out without discussion of destination or duration, and the lane had received them and directed them south. James walked differently from his first visit. The difference was not dramatic, not a night and day transformation, not a conversion narrative, but it was real, and it was legible to anyone who paid attention to how people move through space. He walked at the lane's pace now, rather than his own, which was slower by perhaps 20% from what his natural pace had probably been in his London years. He stopped at the places the lane identified as stopping places. The stile, the gap in the canopy now closed by the winter sky. Though the spot on the lane where the white gold light had fallen in October retained something, Arthur always felt, of what it had received, though he could not have said precisely what. The hollow that collected the rain, and he stopped without any visible internal negotiation, simply recognizing the stopping place and stopping. They talked as they walked, the conversation having the quality that walking conversations between people of similar temperament always produce. Wide-ranging, unhurried, comfortable with his own gaps and returns and changes of direction. James talked about what it meant to retire from 30 years of a particular kind of daily necessity, from a life organized around other people's most urgent needs, which had given his days a structure and a purpose that was entirely real and entirely given, requiring no invention on his part, and what it meant, now that this was over, to construct a purpose from the inside rather than receiving it from the outside. "You have had 11 years of practice," James said, at the stile, where they had both stopped without discussion, at constructing a life from the inside, at deciding, each morning, what the day is for, rather than being told. "I was told," Arthur said, "by the lane." James looked at him with the grey-brown eyes. "Is that different?" Arthur thought about this carefully. "Yes," he said, eventually. "Being told by a lane is different from being told by a timetable. A timetable demands a specific response. It tells you what to do and when to do it, and compliance is the correct mode. The lane," he paused, "the lane makes a suggestion. It shows you what is here, this morning, at this light, in this cold, and then it leaves you entirely free to receive it or to walk past it. The practice is in learning to receive it. James was quiet for a time, looking across the frost-edged field toward Ashmore Wood, where the bare branches made their intricate winter pattern against the December sky. "I think," he said, "that I have spent 30 years being told by a timetable, and that the years before that were being told by a different kind of timetable, and that I have not yet learned what it is to receive a suggestion rather than comply with an instruction." "You are learning," Arthur said. "You stopped at the stile." James looked down at his own hands on the stile stone. He seemed to consider this for a moment. The act of stopping, the fact of his hands on the cold stone, the field beyond, the wood beyond that. "Yes," he said, "I stopped." They stood at the stile for a long time, in the cold, clear December air, looking at a field in winter and finding it entirely sufficient. James left on the morning of the 28th. The carrier was punctual, arriving at the northern end of the lane at 9 o'clock, and the morning was cold and clear with the quality of between things cold, between Christmas and New Year, between the hard frost of the 19th and whatever the remainder of December would bring, between one visit and the next, which James had already established would happen. Arthur said his farewell at the cottage gate. He had walked up the lane with James and Eleanor together, the three of them going at the lane's pace in the cold morning, and had stopped at the gate while the other two continued to the northern end where the carrier waited. He had pressed James's hand for a moment longer than was strictly conventional, because he meant it and wanted this to be clear in the only way available to men of their generation, which was through the slightly extended duration of a handshake. James had said, "March, you mentioned the lane in March as a thing not to be missed." "I did," Arthur said. Then March. He had gone then, with Eleanor, up to the northern end, and Arthur had stood at the gate and watched the two of them go, and watched the carrier's cart come, and James go up into it with his bag, and watched the cart turn and go back onto the Nettleford road and disappear beyond the first curve. Eleanor returned down the lane alone. She passed Arthur at the gate with a nod and a small, precise smile, and went through her own gate to her own garden, and Arthur stood a moment longer at his gate before going in. He went to the bench at the northern end, having dressed again and gone back out because the morning required it, and sat with a blanket across his knees in the cold that was real and deep and entirely clear, and looked south down the lane. The lane was empty. Both sets of boot prints from the morning walk were in the frost still. His, Eleanor's, James's, a small, clear, temporary record of the morning's movement, already beginning to soften at the edges as the frost responded to the slight warmth of the risen sun. By mid-morning, they would be gone. By noon, the frost would be gone too, or mostly gone. The lane would be itself again, completely itself, as it had always been and would continue to be. He sat in the cold and breathed and looked and thought about the specific quality of silence that follows company, the silence that is not the default state of the absence of sound, but a particular silence that is full of what was recently there, the ghost of voice and movement and presence, still audible in the quality of the air if you listened with sufficient attention. He thought this was one of the richest silences he knew, not empty, abundant, full of what had been and what was coming back both at once, the two things not competing but completing each other. The solitude enriched by the recent company, and the company enriched by being received into the solitude. A rook flew over the lane from east to west, calling once, a frank and unembellished sound, the rook's call, as honest as the bird itself. And then the lane was quiet again, and the frost was softening, and the December morning continued its unhurried progress toward noon. Arthur sat and received it. He was good at receiving. He had been practicing for a long time. January passed on the lane with the quiet thoroughness of a month that has no interest in being observed. It was the month Arthur had always found most interesting of all, for exactly this reason. January was the month that demanded nothing, offered nothing of the visual richness of October, none of the honesty of change of November, none of the crystalline drama of December. January on Wych Elm Lane was a month of plain endurance, and Arthur found plain endurance one of the more admirable qualities the world possessed. He walked every morning. He always walked every morning. In January, he sometimes walked in weather that persuaded most people to stay indoors. Not dangerous weather, not weather that constituted any real hazard to a properly dressed person with good boots and a knowledge of the lane's surface, but weather that was simply unpleasant in the way that January weather is often unpleasant, grey, damp, cold, in a way that was not refreshing, but was simply relentless. He walked in this weather because the practice was the practice, regardless of the conditions, and because he had found, over years of walking in January, that the lanes in grey, wet weather had a character entirely their own that was, if anything, more fundamental and more honest than the character they displayed in good light. Eleanor walked most mornings, somewhat later than Arthur, the pattern of her walks now so established as to be itself a kind of daily structure that anchored both her morning and his. He knew from the kitchen window as he made his second tea when she had set out northward, and he knew when she had returned, and this knowledge, not intrusive, not surveillance, simply the natural awareness of a person who pays attention to their immediate world, gave the morning a shape it had previously lacked. One morning in the third week of January, standing at the kitchen window with his morning tea, Arthur noticed something he had not seen before. The light in the lane was different. He put the cup down and leaned forward, his forearms on the cold stone of the sill, and looked more carefully. The difference was not dramatic. It was not in the quality of the light that arrived at the lane's surface. That was still grey, still winter, still the flat, directionless light of January overcast. The difference was in the light that came through the bare elm branches from the sky above. And the difference was this: it was fractionally warmer. Not in colour, the sky was still winter grey, but in temperature, in the quality of the light's relationship to the surfaces it touched. The lichen on the bark caught it slightly differently. The chalk path returned it with a slightly different undertone. The moss at the root bases had, in the last 2 or 3 days, deepened in colour from the midwinter green to a green that was, only very slightly, only to someone who had been looking at it through an entire winter, more vivid. He went to the hall and got his coat and went out to look more carefully. He stood at the base of the third elm on the western side. the one with a slight lean toward the southwest, the one whose mossy roots he knew in detail, and crouched and looked at the moss. And it was there, not imagined, not wishful seeing. The green was deeper, the stems of the moss were, he could not say straighter, but they were more present, more fully extended, as though they were beginning to remember what they were for. Something in the world, far below the surface of any visible evidence, had turned. He stood up and walked back to the cottage with a feeling he had had before, in this exact form, in previous Januaries, and which he had never been able to describe to anyone's satisfaction, including his own, of having been let in on a secret that had always been there, waiting for someone to look closely enough to see it. February arrived and departed with a particular mixed character of February in England. Some days more winter than winter, with a cold that seemed to take the fact of the season as a personal challenge, and some days a startling, unsustainable preview of what was coming, warm and sunny, and smelling of something growing, these days arriving like sentences, in a language you have almost, but not quite learned, the meaning just at the edge of legibility. The lane absorbed both kinds of February day with the same quiet equanimity, being entirely itself in cold and mild with equal completeness, which was one of the qualities Arthur most consistently admired in it. People, in his experience, tended to be somewhat less than their best selves in weather that challenged their preferences. The lane had no such weakness. He walked it every morning without exception. He walked it on the days when the cold was such that the chalk surface was hard as stone, and his boots made a ringing sound at each step, and he walked it on the days when the slight warmth had softened the surface to the particular yielding quality of chalk in a thaw, when each step sank slightly and left a clear impression, and he walked it on the days when rain came horizontally off the north and the lane looked like a place he had never seen before and was the more beautiful for it. Eleanor walked it on most days, and on the days she didn't, the lane knew. He did not know how it knew, but the absence of her footprints in the softer chalk, the absence of her figure from the kitchen window's northward view, had begun to constitute a small but perceptible change in the lane's atmosphere, the way a note left out of a familiar chord constitutes a change that is perceptible even if the listener cannot identify what is missing. He mentioned none of this to her, because it was the kind of observation that works best in a notebook rather than in conversation, and because he thought she probably knew it in her own way. On the 14th of February, a Thursday, he walked the lane at the usual hour in the cold, clear morning and reached the stone stile. And, on an impulse that was not an impulse so much as a response to something his eye had detected before his conscious attention had caught up with it, looked down at the south-facing bank below the wall. 3 snowdrops, very small, very white, very still in the cold air, their heads not yet fully open, still in the bent-over posture of the snowdrop that is in the process of deciding whether the morning is sufficiently encouraging to commit to full bloom, but committed to the act of being here, which was the more important commitment. He crouched in the lane for a long time and looked at them. They were the most vivid thing he had seen since the candle-lit windows of the keeper's house on Christmas Eve. They were white against the dark bank, with the particularity of things that are exactly themselves, not white in general, but these specific snowdrops in this specific bank on this specific cold morning in the 14th of February of the year 1884, with this specific quality of winter light on their petals. They were, in their smallness and their completeness, among the most important things he had ever seen, and he was aware of this importance in a quiet, complete way that required no further processing. He wrote in his field notebook, "Snowdrops. 3. South-facing bank below the stile. February 14th. The year has turned." He straightened. He adjusted his scarf. He walked on, and the 3 snowdrops remained in the cold bank, entirely committed to being what they were, their heads slightly raised toward the light, as though they had heard something coming from a great distance and were inclining toward it. James arrived on the 2nd of March, as he had promised. He came on the afternoon carrier from Abingdon, the same route as Christmas, and he descended from the cart at the northern end of the lane with, Arthur noticed immediately, something different about him. Not in his appearance, which was the same dark green coat and soft grey felt hat, the same leather bag, the same round face with his patient grey-brown eyes, but in his movement. He moved with a slight ease that he had not had in November. The deliberateness was still there, but the care in the deliberateness had changed quality. It was no longer the deliberateness of a man managing physical limitations or navigating unfamiliarity, but the deliberateness of a man who has made a choice about how he moves through the world and is comfortable with that choice. He looked immediately at the lane, not at Arthur, not at Eleanor, who had also come to the northern end, at the lane, at the elm branches, which were in the first barely perceptible stages of budding, not green, not even close to green, but the branches at their tips having a slight swelling that could easily be missed by anyone who had not been looking at them all winter, and which Arthur and Eleanor had both been looking at for several weeks with the expectant attention of people who know exactly what they are waiting for. "Something is happening," James said. "Yes," Arthur said. "I can see it, but I cannot say what I am seeing." "The buds," Eleanor said. "The elm buds. They are beginning." James looked more closely at the nearest elm branch. He put his hand up and very gently touched one of the tip swellings, a gesture that Arthur found deeply appropriate, the instinct of someone who has learned in 30 years of medicine that the first signs of change are always felt in the touch as much as seen in the eye. "Yes," James said, after a moment. "Yes, I feel it." The 3 of them walked the lane together in the March afternoon. The light was different from December and January and February, being warmer in quality without yet being warm in temperature. The sun at an angle that was definitively not winter's angle and not yet spring's angle, but was the specific angle of early March in southern England, which is an angle with more than warmth in it, with a quality of intention. And the lane received the 3 of them with what Arthur could only have described as a general widening of its welcome, as though the season's returning warmth had opened it slightly, made it slightly more available, slightly more generous with what it offered. They stopped at the stone stile, as they always stopped. They stopped at the gap in the canopy, where the south-facing bank now showed a full and confident company of snowdrops, and at the edges, the first yellow of early celandines, small, vivid, the first proper colour the lane had produced since October's gold, and a colour of a completely different kind from October's gold, being not the warm accumulation of summer, but the urgent declaration of returning life. They walked to the bench at the northern end and sat, 3 on a bench that held 3, only if there was goodwill and the willingness not to mind proximity, which all of them had in sufficient supply. The early March light came through the barely budding elm canopy from the southwest in the late afternoon and fell on the lane and on the bench and on the 3 of them with the first warmth that any of them had felt from the lane's light since October. Not strong warmth, nor yet, but warmth, the specific warmth of a world that has turned its face back toward the sun and is beginning, with his habitual patience and his total reliability, to become what it has always been and will always be. Arthur sat on the bench and felt it on his face and closed his eyes for a moment. It was sufficient. It was more than sufficient. It was, as it always was, everything. On one of the last evenings of James's March visit, a Wednesday, with the clear cold sky of a March night that had more stars in it than the winter nights had had, as though the sky were becoming more available, along with everything else. Arthur sat in the sitting room after supper and wrote in his notebook for longer than usual. He wrote until the fire had burned down to coals, and the oil lamp was the primary light in the room, and the window behind him was the full dark of a March night. And still he wrote. He wrote about the year that had passed on the lane. He wrote about October's gold and the word, without name for the colour in the deepest canopy days, and about the afternoon when the gap had shown him the white light and he had stood in the lane for 10 minutes trying to learn it before it moved on. He wrote about November and the word accumulated and the splitting of the oak and the feeling of something always just at the edge of articulation suddenly becoming articulate, the satisfaction of a thing named that had previously only been felt. He wrote about Eleanor's arrival, about watching from the kitchen window as the cart unloaded, about the honey, about the across-table conversation in the mid-process kitchen, about watching her pace on the lane change over the weeks of November, from a pace that was getting somewhere to a pace that was already there. He wrote about what it meant to watch a person arrive, not just geographically, but actually arrive, in the sense of becoming present in the place they have come to. The way a piece of furniture arrives in a room not when it is physically placed, but when the room has accepted it and arranged itself around it. He wrote about James, about the stile on the December morning, and the thrush in Ashmore Wood, and the way James had said, "I heard birds in London," with a particular quality of recognition that comes when a person finds, outside themselves, a name for something that had been without one inside. He wrote about the 3 of them on the bench in the November afternoon, and the Christmas Eve keeper's house with its tallow candles, and the Christmas Day meal that was simple in the way of confidence rather than constraint. He wrote about the post-Christmas silence on the bench, and the rook flying over calling once, and about the quality of the silence after company departs. He wrote about January and February, and the moss at the elm roots becoming more vivid, and the 3 snowdrops in the south-facing bank, and the moment of looking down and understanding that the year had turned. And Then he wrote about himself, which was the difficult part, the part he had been working his way toward through all the preceding pages. He wrote, "I have been trying for 11 years to do one thing. The thing has no name that I find entirely satisfactory, though I have tried many. Attention is too clinical, presence is too abstract. Witnessing is close, but implies an audience. What I have been doing is something more like being here with the full weight of what I am, in this specific place and this specific time, without reservation or distraction, without the mind sliding away toward what was or what might be, simply in what is. The lane has been my teacher in this, not by instruction. The lane gives no instruction, but by demonstration. The lane is always here. It never goes elsewhere. It does not know how to be elsewhere. And in its fundamental here-ness, its absolute commitment to the present moment of its own existence, it models what I have been trying with considerably more difficulty and considerably less success to practice." He stopped writing. He set the pen down. He looked at the fire. He thought, this is enough. The practice has been enough. The lane has been enough. The year has been more than enough. The company has been more than enough. The snowdrops were enough. The thrush in December was enough. The white light through the gap on that October Tuesday was enough. All of it together. The accumulated presence of an entire year of attention, gathered now in the warmth of the sitting room, with the fire burning down, and the March night outside, and the lane waiting in the dark as it always waited, patient as limestone. He thought, I am 61 years old, and I am exactly where I am supposed to be, and the lane is exactly what it has always been, and tomorrow morning I will wake before dawn and lie in the dark and listen to whatever the lane is doing, and it will be enough, and it will be different from today, and it will be exactly right. He closed the notebook. He looked at the fire for a long time. Then he went to bed. On the morning after James left for the last time that spring, Arthur walked the lane at first light. He went before his stove was lit. He went before his tea was made. He went before the day had fully decided what it was going to be, while the sky above the bare but budding elm canopy was still in the grey that precedes colour, the grey of a world not yet committed to its morning, and the lane below it was very still and very cool and very entirely itself. He walked from the cottage gate northward, as he always walked, at the pace the lane required, which was his pace too after 11 years, which was the same thing. His boots on the chalk made their clean, familiar sound. His breath made its small clouds in the cool air. His hand found the first elm trunk and rested on it for a moment, as it did every few days when the need arose to feel the specific texture of the bark, not to check, not to examine, simply to feel, the way you touch the face of someone you have known a long time when you happen to be close to them, and the moment allows it. He stopped at the gap in the canopy. The south-facing bank below was full now, full of snowdrops still, their heads fully open in the increasing warmth of the March mornings, white and complete, and at their edges, crowding in from the warmer soil where the late February sun had found the bank first, the celandines, small, brilliant, intensely yellow, the colour that has no patience and no modesty, the colour of something that has waited all winter for its moment and intends to be entirely clear about its having arrived. He stood and looked at the celandines for a long time. The yellow of them was the first genuine warm colour the lane had produced since October, and it was nothing like October's colour, nothing like the deep, accumulated, patient gold of the elm canopy that had given way so slowly and gracefully to the bare branches of November. The celandines were not patient. They were urgent. They were the colour of something that has something to say and intends to say it now, while the saying can be heard. He received this urgency with the affection you feel for necessary opposites, the slowness of the lane's autumn finding its necessary complement in the urgency of the lane's spring, both honest, both entirely right for what they were. He walked on to the stile. He stood at the stile for a time. The field beyond was greener than it had been in January, greener than February's best days had managed. The grass in the field was beginning to respond to the lengthening days and the changed angle of the sun with the same kind of willingness the moss had shown in January, the same gradual, barely perceptible increase in saturation and depth that was the sign of life resuming its full engagement with the world. From Ashmore Wood, just audible across the field in the still March morning, carried in the clear air with the precision that low temperatures and no wind produce, a blackbird's song. Not the experimental phrases of a bird trying out its spring voice, full, settled, assured. The song of a blackbird that has been practicing for weeks and has arrived this morning at what it wanted to say. Arthur stood at the stile and listened to the blackbird sing in the bare wood across the field, and felt what he always felt in such moments. Not happiness exactly, not the thing that is called happiness in ordinary usage, but something larger and more settled than happiness, something more structural, more foundational. The feeling of being in exactly the right place, at exactly the right time, in possession of exactly the right kind of attention to receive what was being offered. He stood for a long time. The blackbird sang 3 complete phrases and then was silent, as though it had made its point and was satisfied. He turned from the stile and walked back south along the lane. The morning light was arriving properly now. The grey had moved through its stages to the first pale gold of a March morning, not October's gold, not the same thing at all, but something that shared a family resemblance with it, something that came from the same direction and through the same elm canopy and fell on the same chalk path with the same willingness to be received. He stopped at the cottage gate. He looked back down the length of the lane, south, the full 3/4 of a mile of it, from the keeper's house with its smoke just beginning from the chimney. Eleanor was awake, had made her fire, would walk the lane in an hour, to the edge of Ashmore Wood, where the blackbird had been singing, and the sky above all of it was the pale, clear, coming gold of an early March morning in Oxfordshire, and the bare but budding elms along both sides received this light and passed it on to the chalk path below, and the chalk path gave it back to the sky, and the sky gave it back to the elms, and the whole exchange was conducted with the unhurried generosity of things that have been doing this for a very long time and intend to continue. He stood at the gate and breathed the morning. He was Arthur Bellamy, 61 years old, keeper of Wych Elm Lane, and the lane was entirely itself, and the morning was entirely sufficient, and the celandines were yellow on the south-facing bank, and the blackbird had said what it intended to say, and the year had turned. He went inside, The kettle needed putting on. And now, dear listener, the lane is very quiet. The morning has done what mornings on Wych Elm Lane have always done. It has come slowly and with complete certainty through the dark and the grey and the first cool gold of its own arriving, and it has been received by the lane and the elms and the chalk and the moss and the celandines and the man at the gate with his white hair and his ash stick and his 61 years of practice in the art of being present. And it has given what it had to give. You have walked this lane with Arthur Bellamy to a full year of its life. You have been here in the amber gold of its October mornings, when the leaves were turning and the light came through the canopy, like something generated rather than reflected, when a single afternoon produced a column of light on the lane floor that turned the deep gold drifts to something close to white and had no name and needed none. You have been here in November, when the canopy let go and the lane became honest, became bare and grey and beautiful in a different, deeper way, showing what it was made of when the elaboration fell. You have been here at the stone stile in the cold of December, listening with James Marsh to a thrush singing in Ashmore Wood. 4 clear notes, and then 3 more, each phrase a little different from the last, the bird trying out the language of the season. You have been here on the morning of the 19th of December, when the hard frost remade everything into blue-white crystal, and Arthur stood in the lane before he was fully dressed and was simply stopped completely by the beauty of a world being entirely itself. You have been here at Christmas, in the keeper's house with its tallow candles and its holly and its warmth, the 3 of them around the table with good food and good wine, and the particular ease of people who have found, in a short time, a genuine companionship that requires no maintenance. You have been here on the bench on the 28th of December, alone with the silence that follows company, which is a different and richer silence than ordinary silence, full of what was recently there. You have been here in January's flat grey faithfulness, in February's tentative returning warmth, in the moment when 3 snowdrops in a south-facing bank were the most important things in the world, and a man crouched in the cold lane to look at them properly. You have been here this morning at the gate, in the pale gold of a March morning, with the celandines yellow on the bank, and the blackbird's song just finished in the wood, and Eleanor's chimney beginning its thin, faithful smoke, and the year, the full year, having turned. You have been in a lane in Oxfordshire in late autumn through winter to the first morning of spring, and the quality of that experience, the light, the cold, the sound of boots on chalk, the warmth of a fire in a stone cottage, the particular silence of the Wych Elm canopy in a still December morning. That is as true as anything that has words. And now it is time to let the lane go gently. Not lose it. You do not lose the places you have genuinely visited. They remain in the body, in the warmth behind the sternum, in the quality of attention that certain experiences leave as a residue, making you slightly more capable of receiving the next beautiful thing than you were before you received this one. But let it become, now, very quiet. Let the lane recede the way lanes recede when you have walked them and turned for home, not disappearing, but becoming interior, becoming part of what you carry in ours. Let your body be heavy in the way that bodies are heavy at the end of a long walk well taken, heavy with use, with having been fully present in a place that required your full presence, with the specific pleasant tiredness of a person who has paid attention for a sustained and nourishing time. Let your thoughts slow, one by one, the way the elm leaves slowed and turned and settled, not forced, not suppressed, simply allowed to complete themselves and come to rest, one after another, in the gathering quiet. There is nothing to attend to now. There is nothing to understand or decide or accomplish. The lane is keeping itself, as it always does. Arthur is at the gate, or back in the cottage with the kettle on, or perhaps already seated in the green velvet chair, with his morning tea, watching the March light move through the elm canopy that is beginning very slowly to consider becoming green again. Eleanor will walk the lane in an hour. The blackbird will sing again in Ashmore Wood when the morning has fully committed to itself. The celandines will be there tomorrow, and the day after, and the week after, becoming more numerous as March deepens into April, and the cold finally relents entirely, and the lane begins once more its annual return to abundance. None of this requires your presence tonight. It is all proceeding exactly as it should. The lane does not need to be watched to continue. It has been continuing for a very long time, and it will continue long after any one watcher is gone. And this continuity, this deep, limestone-rooted, patient continuity, is one of the most comforting facts in the world, if you let it be. Let it be. Let the weight of this moment, this particular stillness at the edge of sleep, settle around you with the quality of the lane's own stillness, which is not emptiness, but fullness, not absence, but presence, the presence of everything that has ever been here, gathered quietly into what is here now. Your breathing is the sound of the lane in a still December morning. In, the cold air, clean and mineral and slightly resinous. Out, the breath that makes a small cloud in the still air and dissipates. In, out, in. The lane is very still. The fire is low and warm. The elms are standing in the dark. The chalk path is pale beneath the stars. You are here, dear listener. You are exactly where you are supposed to be. The morning is coming, as it always comes, with complete and patient certainty. But not yet. For now, the dark is good, and the quiet is good, and your breathing is good, slow and steady as the lane itself. And there is nothing you need to do, but let yourself go gently toward the rest that is already here, already prepared for you, already waiting with the unhurried certainty of something that has been expecting you for quite some time. Sleep now. The keeper is at his post. The lane is entirely itself. And you, dear listener, are already very nearly there. Let go. Sleep